Edmund Ashcroft slammed his fist against the sheriff's desk so hard that the coffee mug jumped and shattered on the floor, and nobody in that room dared to breathe. 50 men, he said, his voice dropping to something colder than the blizzard raging outside. 50 men, and not one of you can tell me where my daughter is. The sheriff didn't look up. He just kept staring at the map on his desk, the one with all the red marks where they'd already searched, and that silence said everything Edmund didn't want to hear. Mr. Ashcroft, don't! Edmund held up one hand. His jaw was tight. His eyes were dry, but not because he wasn't feeling anything. They were dry the way a man's eyes go dry when he's decided that grief is a luxury he cannot afford right now. Don't tell me about the storm. Don't tell me about the risk. You tell me where my daughter is, or you get out of my way and let me find someone who actually wants to look. The sheriff finally met his eyes, and what Edmund saw there was worse than anger. It was pity. Sir, the sheriff said quietly, it's been 4 days. If you've ever watched someone's world fall apart in real time, if you've ever seen the exact moment when a person realizes that all their money, all their power, all the things they spent a lifetime building cannot buy back the one thing that matters most, then you already know what Edmund Ashcroft's face looked like in that moment. And if you haven't, just imagine standing in a room full of people who have already given up on someone you love, and realizing you are completely alone. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you believe that courage and compassion still exist in this world, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that mountain, because what happened next will stay with you. The morning Vivian Ashcroft disappeared, the sky had been the particular shade of white that old mountain men called a liar's sky. It looked calm. It looked almost gentle, the kind of pale winter morning that made you think the worst was already over. She had been traveling by stagecoach from Denver to the small rail depot at Cedar Fork, a journey her father had made arrangements for a dozen times before. The route was well-traveled. The driver was experienced. There were 2 other passengers, a land surveyor named Colby and a widowed schoolteacher named Mrs. Pratt, and everyone agreed later, in the way that people agree on things they wish they could change, that there had been no real reason for alarm, until the storm dropped out of the mountains like a wall. Witnesses at the last relay station said it came fast, faster than anyone expected. 1 minute the road was visible, and then it simply wasn't. The driver had pushed forward, trying to reach the next shelter before conditions worsened, and that decision, that single, ordinary human decision made under pressure, was the last one anyone could account for. The stagecoach never arrived at Cedar Ford. The land surveyor and Mrs. Pratt were found the following morning, half frozen but alive, sheltering beneath a rock overhang about 2 miles west of where the coach had gone off the trail. They had both jumped when the rear wheel broke through a snow shelf above a ravine. The driver had jumped too. All 3 of them had been accounted for within 36 hours. Vivian had not been with them. The surveyor, Colby, said she had been asleep when it happened, said he'd reached for her arm and grabbed only air, said when he looked back she was already gone. Gone was a word that covered a lot of possibilities in the Colorado Rockies in January, and almost none of them were good. Edmund Ashcroft had received the telegram at his offices in Denver at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, and by noon he was already on a horse heading north, which was how you knew the kind of man he was. Edmund Ashcroft did not wait for coaches. He did not wait for confirmations or proper arrangements. He had built a railroad empire across 3 territories by being the kind of man who moved while other men were still thinking, and whatever flaw that quality may have created in him over the years, and there were flaws, we will get to those, in this particular moment it meant he arrived at the base of the search area before most of the hired riders had even saddled up. He paid for 50 men himself, 50 professional riders, trackers, and mountain guides, the best that money could assemble on short notice in that part of Colorado. He doubled their normal rate and offered a bonus that made grown men lean forward in their chairs. He sent them up the mountain in organized groups with signal flares and written protocols, because even in crisis, Edmund Ashcroft's mind defaulted to systems and organization, and in another life that might have been admirable. For 4 days, those 50 men searched. They found the broken coach halfway down a gully, its axle snapped and its roof caved in under the weight of snow. They found one of Vivian's gloves, pale blue with pearl buttons, caught on a branch about 40 feet from the wreck. They found her traveling trunk, still latched, buried under 3 feet of fresh powder. They found the blue glove's partner 20 yards further east. They did not find Vivian. On the morning of the 5th day, with another storm system building over the northern peaks and temperatures dropping toward what the older guides were calling genuinely dangerous, the lead tracker, a weathered man named Haskell, who had been working these mountains for 30 years, came down and stood before Edmund Ashcroft and told him, in the careful voice of a man who has delivered this kind of news before, that he believed the search should be suspended. She would have needed shelter, Haskell said. In those temperatures, without gear, without a fire. 4 nights, Mr. Ashcroft. Edmund stared at him. We've been up every accessible canyon on that face, Haskell continued. Checked every rock formation, every stand of timber thick enough to offer windbreak. I've got men who've worked avalanche rescues for 20 years, and they're telling me, I didn't ask what your men are telling you, Edmund said. Haskell held his gaze. He was one of the few men in Colorado who could do that without flinching. I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway, because that's what you're paying me to do. A pause. I'm sorry, Mr. Ashcroft. I truly am. She seemed like a fine young woman. Was. Past tense. Already past tense. Edmund said nothing. He turned and walked back to the relay station where he'd been sleeping in a cot for 4 nights, and he sat on the edge of that cot in the dark for a long time, doing the terrible arithmetic that grief forces you to do. 4 nights in those temperatures. No gear. No shelter that 50 trained men could find. He was a man who dealt in facts. He had built everything he owned on the discipline of facing facts squarely, without sentiment, without the comfortable cushion of wishful thinking. He knew what the facts were saying. He just couldn't make himself say it back. 2 miles up the mountain, in the hours just before dawn, a man named Silas Boone was skinning a rabbit by firelight when something made him stop. He couldn't have told you exactly what it was. Not a sound. The wind was too loud for that, rattling through the pine boughs with the kind of persistence that gets into your skull after a while. Not a smell. Nothing he could point to and name. It was more like the feeling you get sometimes in the deep, quiet parts of solitary work, when the noise in your own head goes still for a moment, and something underneath it gets a chance to surface. He had been aware of the search, the way a man living alone in the mountains becomes aware of things, not directly, but through small signals. The distant flare lights 3 nights ago, the faint echo of shouted names bouncing off canyon walls. He had watched from his ridge as the last of the search party descended that morning, and he had felt something about that, a discomfort he couldn't quite place, like a word you can't remember that sits on the tip of your tongue. Silas set down the rabbit. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the mouth of the small overhang where he'd been working, and he looked out at the mountain above him. 50 men. He'd watched them from a distance, through the gaps in the storm when visibility allowed. They had been thorough. He would give them that. They had worked the accessible terrain the way professionals work, systematically, efficiently, covering the ground that could be covered. He stood there for a moment, his breath making small white ghosts in the cold air, and then he turned and looked at his daughter's sleeping form bundled under every blanket he owned in the corner of the shelter. May, 7 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her mother's infuriating habit of asking questions that Silas didn't have good answers for. "Papa," she had said the night before, hearing the distant calls of the search party through the wind, "do you think they'll find her?" "I don't know, May. Do you think someone should help them look?" He had not answered that one. He just stoked the fire and told her to go to sleep. Silas looked at the mountain for a long time. He was not a man who explained himself much, not even to himself. But he had one rule that he had never found a way around, no matter how hard life had occasionally made him wish otherwise. He could not walk away from something that might still have a chance, just because walking toward it was hard. His wife, Clara, had called it stubbornness. She had not meant it as a compliment exactly, but she hadn't entirely meant it as a criticism either. It was just the word she used for the part of him that refused to accept that some things were simply done. Clara had been gone for 3 years now. There were days when the stubbornness felt like the only thing she'd left him. He went back inside, checked the fire, checked May, and began pulling on his outer layers. The heavy wool coat, the oilcloth over that. The boots he'd reinforced himself with extra leather around the ankle. He moved quietly, the way a man moves when he's been alone long enough that silence has become a habit rather than an effort. He was lacing the second boot when he stopped. He tried to think it through rationally, the way he always did before committing to something that might get him killed. The search party had 50 trained men. They had been up there for 4 days. They had not found her. The logical conclusion, the one that anyone reasonable would reach, was that there was nothing to find, that the mountain had already made its decision about Vivian Ashcroft, and that the only question now was where, in the spring thaw, they would discover the evidence of that decision. Silas finished lacing the boot. The thing was, he knew this particular stretch of mountain in a way that those 50 men didn't. Not because he was better than them, he wasn't arrogant about what he knew and didn't know, but because he'd lived here for 11 years through every season, and mountains have personalities the way people do. They have habits, they have places they keep things. There was one canyon the search party had not entered. He'd watched them pull back from the approach to it on the second day, which made sense. The entry was deceptive, an open-looking pass that narrowed without warning into a slot barely wide enough for a horse, and beyond that the terrain dropped in a way that read as impassable from above. 3 of his trap lines ran through that canyon. He knew it the way he knew the layout of his own hands. It was probably nothing. She was probably gone, and he was probably about to risk May losing her father over a stubborn feeling that had no rational justification. He stood up and reached for his pack. He left a note for May. Gone up to check trapline 4. Back before dark. Food in the iron pot. Stay inside. Because May could read now, she'd made sure of that herself through a process of determined interrogation that still made him tired to think about. He left the note where she'd see it when she woke, and then he stepped out into the pre-dawn dark and started climbing. The cold was the kind that gets inside your skull and sits there. He'd stopped noticing it the way a person stops noticing background noise after a while, which was its own kind of danger, because the cold that you stopped noticing was the cold that eventually killed you. He kept his pace steady, conserving heat through movement, and he let his eyes adjust slowly to the dark rather than trying to force it, which was something it had taken him years to learn. He wasn't thinking about Vivian Ashcroft as he climbed. He was thinking about the slope above the canyon entry, which had received new snowfall and would be unstable in the upper section. He was thinking about the angle of approach that would put him on the most solid ground. He was thinking about May waking up and reading the note and doing the face she did sometimes, the one that was supposed to look unconcerned but wasn't quite pulling it off. The pass was where he remembered it. He moved through the narrow slot sideways in places, the rock walls close enough on either side that he could touch both with his elbows, and then the canyon opened up on the other side and the sky lightened just enough that he could see the shape of things. He was maybe 40 yards into the canyon proper when he saw it. It was nothing, really, just a small shape in the texture of the snow against the canyon wall, a shadow where there shouldn't have been one, given the angle of the early light. Most men would have walked right past it. Most men had, apparently. Silas stopped. He stood completely still for a moment, the cold pressing in from all sides, and he looked at that shadow and made himself think slowly, which was the opposite of what every instinct was yelling at him to do. An animal den, maybe. A rock formation beneath the surface. Snow settling in an unusual pattern over a hollow. That happened sometimes. The snow remembered the shapes of things, even after the things themselves weren't visible anymore. He took 3 steps toward it. The shadow moved. Not much. Just slightly, the way something moves when it's been absolutely still for a very long time, and then something, a sound, a presence, some animal sense of another living creature nearby, causes the tiniest involuntary shift. The kind of movement that isn't voluntary. The kind of movement a body makes because it's still alive. Silas was already running before his mind had finished processing what he'd seen, and he was not a man who ran without reason, but this was the most reason he'd ever had. He dropped to his knees in the snow beside what turned out to be a figure, a young woman, curled beneath an overhang of rock that the canyon wall formed about 2 feet above the canyon floor, barely large enough to qualify as shelter, but large enough that it had broken the worst of the wind. She had wedged herself in there with the deliberateness of someone who had understood, on some fundamental level, that movement would kill her faster than stillness. She was covered, partly, by what had been a traveling coat. One of the coat's buttons was missing. Her hands were tucked under her arms. Her face was turned toward the rock wall. She was the palest thing he had seen in 11 years of mountain winters. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, hoarser, and he realized his throat had gone tight. "Hey, look at me." Nothing. He pulled off his outer glove and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat, below the jaw, the way the old doctor in Cedar Fork had shown him once during a season when Silas had found himself responsible for another human life for the first time and been terrified of all the ways he could make a mistake. He felt it. Faint. Slow. But there. "Okay," he said, not to her exactly. Maybe to himself. Maybe to Clara, or to whatever stubborn thing inside him had refused to go back to sleep when it should have. "Okay, you're not done yet." He reached in and pulled her out carefully, the way you move something fragile, and her body was stiff with cold and her breathing was so shallow he had to watch her chest for several seconds before he was sure he was actually seeing it. But she was breathing. In his 11 years on that mountain, Silas Boone had pulled 3 animals out of traps that he'd thought were already gone, and every single time there had been that same moment of held breath, that same suspension between what seemed true and what turned out to be true. He got her up into his arms, which was harder than it should have been, because his own hands were losing feeling, and she was dead weight, unresponsive, and he was not a large man, strong from 11 years of hard physical work, but not tall, not broad, not the kind of man anyone would have cast in the role of rescuer if they were thinking about it from the outside. He stood up with her. I took 1 step, then another, and then he was moving, slow and careful, back toward the canyon entrance. And in his chest, there was something that wasn't quite relief yet, because relief required certainty, and he had none. But it was the thing that lives next to relief, the thing that keeps a person moving when moving is all there is. Behind him, in the hollow beneath the rock where she had somehow survived 4 nights alone in the Colorado Rockies. In January, the snow was already beginning to fill back in, erasing the evidence of her, as if the mountain had decided to give her back reluctantly and wanted to pretend it hadn't. Silas kept moving. His mind had already shifted to the practical, the way his mind always did in crisis, because the practical was where he lived and where he was useful. She needed warmth. Real warmth, not a campfire, core temperature brought up slowly or you risked the heart stuttering. She needed fluids, but not yet. Not until she was conscious and could swallow without the risk of aspiration. She needed shelter, his shelter, which was 40 minutes away in normal conditions, but would take longer today with what he was carrying. He thought about May waking up to the note. He thought about the second storm the sky had been promising all morning. He thought about all the things that could still go wrong between this canyon and his cabin. He adjusted his grip, tucked her more securely against his chest, and started up through the pass. The mountain pressed down around them. The wind had picked up since he'd come through, and it was moving loose snow and shifting curtains that reduced visibility and turned familiar terrain unreliable. He kept his eyes on the ground immediately ahead, picking each step with care, and he talked to her while he walked, not because he thought she could hear him, but because silence in conditions like this was its own kind of enemy. "You picked a decent spot," he said. "That overhang. Blocked the north wind. That was smart." She didn't answer. Her head was against his shoulder and her breathing was still shallow, but it was still there, still happening, which was all he was asking of it for now. "May's going to have opinions about this," he said. "Fair warning, she has opinions about most things." The wind pushed at him from the left. He leaned into it and kept moving. Somewhere below them, in a relay station at the base of the mountain, Edmund Ashcroft was still sitting on the edge of a cot in the dark, doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish, and his daughter was still alive. She was cold and broken and barely breathing, and the man carrying her was a widower with a 7-year-old in a line of traps and a stubbornness that had no rational justification, and none of that was how any of this was supposed to go. But she was alive. And sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes, that is enough. He made it back to the cabin in just over an hour. Later, when he tried to reconstruct exactly how, he couldn't do it with any clarity. He remembered the wind. He remembered one patch of iced-over rock near the tree line where his left boot skidded, and he went down on one knee, catching himself with his elbow, Vivian still pressed against his chest, and his whole body going rigid with the effort of not dropping her. He remembered the way her breathing changed somewhere in that last stretch, a tiny shift in rhythm, a sound that wasn't quite a word but wasn't nothing either, and how that sound hit him somewhere in the sternum and kept him moving when his legs were telling him to stop. He remembered the cabin door. He remembered kicking it open because both his hands were occupied, and he was past the point of caring about the hinges, and the rush of warm air from inside hitting his face like something he hadn't known he was desperate for until it arrived. May was awake. She was sitting at the table with the note in her hand and her breakfast untouched in front of her, and when the door came open, she stood up so fast the bench scraped back across the floor. Her eyes went to him first, checking him, the way a child does when a parent has been somewhere dangerous. Then they went to what he was carrying. She didn't scream. She didn't ask a dozen questions at once the way she usually did. She just stood there for one long moment, taking it in, and then she said very quietly, "Is she dead?" "No," Silas said. "Move the blankets off my cot." May moved. She was 7 years old and she had lived her whole conscious life in the mountains with a father who didn't waste motion or words, and whatever qualities that upbringing had or hadn't given her, it had given her the ability to act quickly and without theatrics when something actually required it. She had the blankets pulled back before Silas had crossed the room, and she stood aside while he lowered Vivian onto the cot, as carefully as he could manage with hands that had mostly stopped giving him accurate sensory information. "Get the fire built up," he said. "Not hot. Don't open the damper all the way. I don't want fast heat. Medium, steady." "I know how to build a fire, Papa." "I know you do." He heard her moving behind him while he worked on Vivian's outer layers. The frozen coat, the boots, the things that were actively pulling heat away from her. Her clothing was a problem. It was soaked in places, stiff in others, and Vivian herself was no help because she was unconscious, which made everything slower and more complicated. Silas worked methodically, the way he did everything, and tried not to think about how still she was. Her hands were the thing that worried him most. The fingers had a color that he recognized and didn't like. Not black, not yet, not the deep tissue damage that couldn't be undone, but close enough to the edge that he couldn't dismiss it. He pressed each finger between his palms for a moment, working slow warmth back into them, watching her face for any response. Nothing yet. But the breathing was still there, slow and thin, but there. "Papa?" May said from behind him. "What?" "Who is she?" Silas didn't look away from what he was doing. "I don't know her name." A pause. "She was the one they were looking for, wasn't she? The one everyone was shouting about." "Probably." Another pause. "They stopped looking." "Yeah," Silas said, "they did." He heard May consider that in the particular silence she used for things she was filing away rather than discarding. Then the sound of the damper being adjusted and the fire catching with a low crackle that filled the cabin with something that felt, in that moment, like the most important sound in the world. The next several hours were not gentle. Warming someone who has been cold that long is a slow, ugly process. Nothing like the clean, dramatic recoveries that stories like to describe. The body wakes up reluctant and angry, and it makes that reluctance known. Vivian surfaced into partial consciousness sometime around mid-morning, and the first thing she did was shudder so violently that Silas had to hold her still to keep her from rolling off the cot. The second thing she did was make a sound, low, raw, not quite a word, that May later described to him as the saddest thing I've ever heard, which from a child who had watched her mother die was not a small statement. "Easy," Silas said. He said it close, not soft exactly, but low. "Easy. You're inside. You're warm. You're not dying." Her eyes opened. Or one of them did, partially. The left one. The right one seemed to be having trouble, still swollen from what he now could see was a cut along the brow line, probably from the coach coming apart. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin and then, slowly, at him. He had been looked at with a lot of different expressions in his life. He had been looked at with indifference and with suspicion and with the particular flat evaluation that strangers gave him when they were trying to decide if he was worth their time. He was a plain-looking man who wore his years on his face, and he knew it. He was not prepared for the way she looked at him, which was with an expression so raw and unguarded that it made him feel like he'd intruded on something private, like he'd walked into a room he hadn't been invited into. She said something. He leaned closer. "Real," she said. The word barely made it out. Yeah, he said. I'm real. She closed the one eye that was open. Her breathing steadied a fraction. He stayed where he was, crouched beside the cot, because something about the moment made moving seem like a mistake. Papa, May said from across the room, in the careful voice she used when she thought she might be interrupting something but couldn't quite help herself. She needs to drink something. Not yet. But, May. He looked at her. Not yet, I know. May pressed her lips together and turned back to the fire. Vivian slept for most of that day, and sleeping was what she needed, so Silas let her sleep and moved the cabin around her needs with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to reorganize a life on short notice. He fed May. He checked the trap line nearest the cabin, the one he could manage without going far in weather that was starting to build again outside. He came back and checked on Vivian and fed the fire and then sat at the table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold and stared at nothing in particular. He was thinking about the 50 men who had not found her. He was not smug about it. That wasn't in him, the smug satisfaction of being right when professionals were wrong. What he felt was closer to unease, the quiet discomfort of someone who had gotten lucky and knew it, who understood that the only real difference between finding her and not finding her was 11 years of trap lines through that particular canyon. If it had been any other canyon, he would have walked past her the same as everyone else. If the early light had hit the snow at a different angle, or if he'd left the cabin 20 minutes later, or 20 minutes earlier, or if she hadn't shifted at exactly the moment she did. Luck wore a lot of different costumes. This one happened to look like stubbornness, but underneath it was still luck. He thought about Edmund Ashcroft, whom he had never met but had heard of. Everyone in 3 territories had heard of Edmund Ashcroft. Sitting down at that base camp, dealing with whatever a man deals with when he's been told his daughter is gone. Silas knew something about that. He knew what it felt like to wait for news in the dark, and have the news be the kind you couldn't recover from the normal way. He didn't wish it on anyone, including a man he'd never spoken to. He should send word, he knew that. He should get word down the mountain that she was alive and here. The problem was the storm. He stood up and went to the window and looked at it the way he always looked at building weather. Not with alarm, but with a careful professional attention. Reading the cloud formations, the way the snow was falling, the subtle shift in wind direction that he'd noticed when he came back from the trap line. What was coming was not the catastrophic system of the previous week. It was not going to bury the mountain, but it was going to close the pass for at least 2 days, maybe 3, and it was going to make the lower trail, the only route that was manageable in winter, genuinely dangerous for anyone who didn't know it well. He sat back down. 2 days, maybe 3. That was how long Edmund Ashcroft was going to spend not knowing. Silas picked up his coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. Vivian woke properly that evening when the light outside had dropped to the flat gray of a winter dusk, and the cabin smelled of pine smoke and the rabbit stew May had insisted on making herself, with only the amount of supervision she deemed acceptable, which was minimal. She sat up slowly, and the blanket fell away from one shoulder, and she looked around the cabin with an expression of such complete disorientation that it was almost painful to witness. Silas was at the table. May was beside the fire. They both looked at her. "Where—" she started and then stopped. She swallowed. Tried again. "How long have I been here?" "Since this morning," Silas said. She looked at the window, looked at the fire, looked at May, who was looking back at her with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude and is not particularly inclined to learn it. "You're little," Vivian said to May. "I'm 7, May said, in a tone that communicated that 7 was not little exactly, just a specific and respectable size. Something moved across Vivian's face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. Then she winced, and her hand went to her head, touching the area above her right eye where the cut was. She felt the edge of it carefully, the way you touch something you're not sure about. "I cleaned it," Silas said. "Best I could. You're going to want a doctor to look at it when we get back down." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the same way she'd looked at him when she first woke, but without the shock and disorientation making it complicated. Just looking at him, taking stock. "You found me," she said. It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "Yeah." "The others—" She paused. Her brow furrowed, and then a different kind of awareness moved into her expression. "They stopped looking." Silas didn't say anything. "I heard them," she said. "The first 2 days." I heard them calling my name. I tried to answer, but I couldn't. My throat, the cold. I couldn't get the sound out loud enough. A pause. And then on the third day, I didn't hear them anymore. He watched her sit with that. It was a specific kind of thing to sit with, the knowledge that you were the right side of the line, but that the line was very close, and the reason you were on the right side of it was not entirely anything you'd done. "What's your name?" she asked. "Silas Boone." "Vivian Ashcroft." She said it with the automatic reflex of someone who had been introducing herself formally since she was old enough to be presented to rooms full of people. Then she seemed to hear how it sounded in this particular room, in this particular cabin, and something shifted in her expression, a flicker of something she wasn't sure what to do with. "I know who you are," Silas said. "Not personally, just your father has been looking for you." "My father?" She said it differently than she'd said her own name. More weight in it, more complicated weight. "He must be—" She stopped again. "He had 50 men up here," May offered, from beside the fire. "Papa saw them." Vivian looked at May, then back at Silas. 50 men. "It's a big mountain," Silas said. He was already getting up, moving toward the pot on the stove. "You should eat something, small amount. Your stomach isn't going to want much, but it needs something." She started to argue and then seemed to decide against it, which he suspected cost her something. She looked like someone who was accustomed to weighing in on what happened to her, and conceding the point didn't come naturally. He brought her a small bowl of the stew, and she ate it in the slow, focused way of someone whose body was doing the eating, rather than their appetite. May watched her from across the room, and Vivian, after the second spoonful, noticed the watching and looked up. "What?" Vivian said. "Nothing," May said. "I just thought you'd be different." "Different how?" May considered this with the seriousness she gave to most things. "My papa said your father owns the railroad. I thought people like that looked different, but you just look like somebody who was very cold." Vivian put down the spoon. She looked at May for a long moment, and whatever she was thinking, she decided to be honest about it. "Right now, that's probably all I am." Silas, at the stove, said nothing, but something in his shoulders settled slightly, in the way of a man who has been waiting to see how a person behaves when they have no performance left in them, and has gotten an answer he wasn't entirely expecting. The storm arrived in earnest overnight, and by morning the world outside the cabin had narrowed to about 15 feet of visibility and a wind that hit the walls with a sound like continuous low thunder. Silas had known it was coming and had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything. Without drama, without complaining about it, just doing what needed to be done. Extra wood brought inside. The animals he kept, 2 goats and a mule named Henry, who had opinions about winter, settled and secure in the lean-to off the back of the cabin that he'd built specifically to weather conditions like this. Vivian was stronger in the morning. Not well, not by a long distance, but strong enough to be frustrated by not being well, which was its own kind of progress. She sat up on the cot with a blanket around her shoulders and looked at the window and then at Silas, and he could see her doing the calculation. "How long?" she asked. 2 days? Maybe 3. She pressed her lips together. "My father can't do anything about the weather," Silas said. Not unkindly, just factually, the way he said most things. "Neither can we. He's going to be where he is, and we're going to be where we are until it clears, and worrying about the gap between those two things isn't going to close it any faster." She stared at him. That's a very practical thing to say to someone who has been missing for almost a week. Practical is usually what the situation needs. Practical doesn't account for what my father is going through right now. "No," Silas agreed. "It doesn't." He paused. "But it accounts for what we can actually do about it, which is nothing until the storm breaks." "So," a silence, then, "do you always talk like that?" "Like what?" "Like every sentence has already had everything unnecessary removed from it." May, who was listening from her corner of the cabin with the focused attention she gave to all adult conversations that she had decided were interesting, said, "Yes, he does." Silas looked at his daughter. May looked back at him with an expression of complete innocence. He turned back to what he was doing, which was sharpening a knife, and did not dignify either comment with a response. Those 2 days inside the cabin while the storm pressed down around them were not comfortable in any simple sense of the word. The cabin was small. One room, essentially, with a sleeping area curtained off for May that Silas had rigged years ago for the privacy of it, and the main space with the table and the fire and the cot where Vivian was recovering. 3 people in a space built for 2, in conditions that did not allow for going outside to get perspective, was a particular kind of close. Vivian was not a gracious patient. She clarified this herself on the second morning when Silas suggested she rest instead of trying to stand up. And she told him, with the controlled precision of someone making an effort not to be openly rude, that she had been resting for a day and a half, and that she intended to sit at the table like a person, and she would appreciate it if he would stop looking at her like she was about to fall. "You might fall," he said. "I have managed my own movements for 24 years. Not after 4 nights in a canyon, you haven't." She met his eyes. He met hers. She stood up, walked to the table, sat down without falling, and picked up the mug of tea he'd been about to bring to her. She looked at him over the rim of it with an expression that said, "Point made." "Fine," he said, and went back to his work. May watched this exchange with the expression of someone cataloging it for later use. It was May, in the end, who made the cabin survivable for all 3 of them. She was 7 years old, and she had the social fluency of someone much older, not in the polished, trained way that Vivian had been raised with, but in the raw, intuitive way of a child who has spent a lot of time as the sole companion of a quiet adult and has learned to fill silence without crowding it. She talked to Vivian the way she talked to everything she found interesting, which was directly and without the moderating filter of social anxiety. She told Vivian about Henry the Mule and his opinions. She told Vivian about the fox family she'd been watching from the window since October, and how the mother fox had 3 kits this year but last year had 4, and the year before only 1, and she had a theory about why that was, which she shared in considerable detail. She asked Vivian about Denver, which she had never seen, and about the railroad, and about what it was like to live in a house with more than 1 room. Vivian answered. Carefully at first, then with more ease, she asked May questions back, which May considered carefully before answering, because May was not in the habit of giving any question less than its due. Silas moved around all of this, mostly quiet, doing the things that needed doing. He was aware of it. The way the 2 of them were finding a language together, the sound of Vivian's voice losing some of its careful edges as the hours passed. He didn't involve himself. It wasn't his conversation. But he listened. He heard Vivian describe the coach accident in short, controlled sentences that didn't quite cover what was underneath them. He heard the way her breath changed when she talked about those first hours alone in the cold, the way she'd realized the others had jumped and she was the only one still in the coach when it went over the edge. He heard her tell May, matter-of-factly, about crawling out of the wreck with a bleeding head and no real sense of direction, and finding the overhang by accident when she tripped over a rock formation in the dark. "I didn't think it was going to save me," she told May. "I just thought it was better than being in the wind." "But it did save you," May said. "You're right," Vivian said. "It did." "Papa says most things that save you don't look like they're going to at first," May said. "He says that's what makes it hard to trust them." A pause. "Your father says that?" "He said it about Mama dying, that it was going to be okay even when it didn't look like it was going to be. And it is okay now, mostly." Silas, at the window checking the weather, became very still for a moment. "Mostly," Vivian said quietly. "Well," May said, with the honest practicality of a 7-year-old who has thought about something a great deal, "there's still the part where I miss her. That part doesn't go away. But Papa says that's the part that means she was real, and it matters that she was here, so I try to think of it that way." The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence than the ones that had come before it. Softer, maybe. More considered. Silas turned back to the window. Outside, the storm pressed on. The second night, Vivian couldn't sleep. He knew because he couldn't sleep either. He rarely slept well during heavy weather, some old habit of vigilance that his body refused to abandon. And he heard her shifting on the cot, heard the particular quality of wakefulness that is different from restlessness. He didn't say anything for a while. He lay on his bedroll near the fire the way he did when Vivian was using the cot, listening to the storm work itself against the cabin walls, and waited to see if the silence would resolve itself. It didn't. "You can't sleep," he said. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "Did I wake you?" "No." A pause. "I keep thinking about my father sitting in that search camp," she said, I keep thinking about what they told him. Silas said nothing. He's not a man who handles not knowing, she said. He handles things. He manages things. He builds things and runs them and makes them go in the direction he points them. Not knowing is... She stopped. It's not something he has any practice with. Most people don't, Silas said, until they have to. Were you able to? She asked. When your wife was ill? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I was pretty bad at it, actually. He heard her shift, turning toward his voice in the dark. What did you do? Tried to fix things that couldn't be fixed, he said. Made decisions that were really about me not being able to stand still. Thought that if I kept moving, kept doing, it would change the outcome. A pause. It didn't. I'm sorry, she said. And the thing about the way she said it was that it didn't sound like the automatic condolence that people had been giving him for 3 years, the reflexive sorry that meant nothing in particular. It sounded like she actually was. She was the one who was calm about it, he said, and he was surprised to hear himself saying it because it wasn't something he talked about. Clara. She was the one who sat still and let things be what they were, and I was the one running around trying to make it different. And in the end, she was the one who got to leave in peace. And I was the one standing there still trying to change it. He paused. I don't know what that means exactly. I've thought about it a lot. Maybe it means she trusted things more than you did, Vivian said. Maybe. The fire settled. Outside the storm pressed on. Mr. Boone, she said. Silas. Silas, she said it once, trying it out. Why did you come up there? After the others had stopped. He thought about it. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the honest answer required some care. I knew a part of the mountain they hadn't been in, he said, and I couldn't. I couldn't make myself assume that meant there was nothing in it, not until I'd looked. That simple? It's not simple, he said. It's just what I could do. So I did it. Another silence. Then she said, You could have died up there, in that weather, carrying me. Could have, he agreed. Why is that not something you're more bothered by? He thought about it again. May needs me, he said. So I don't take risks I don't need to take, but this one I needed to take. A pause. I'd rather May be angry at me for taking a necessary risk than have her grow up watching her father walk away from one. The silence that followed was very long. He heard Vivian breathing in the dark, and then he heard the quality of her breathing change, very slightly, in the way that sometimes precedes crying and sometimes doesn't. It didn't, this time. She steadied herself. Try to sleep, he said. I'll try. He closed his eyes. The storm pressed on outside, patient and indifferent, doing what storms do. By the morning of the third day, the wind had dropped, and by afternoon the sky had gone to the particular pale blue that follows a storm, the way quiet follows a slammed door. Complete, almost startling in its contrast. Silas stood outside the cabin and looked at the mountain above and the trail below and made his assessment, the same careful reading of conditions he'd been doing for 11 years, and concluded what he'd expected to conclude. They could go down tomorrow. He went inside and told Vivian. She stood up from the table where she'd been sitting with May. The two of them engaged in some kind of card game that May had invented the rules for and was, by all appearances, winning. Vivian looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite classify. Relief was in it, but so was something else, something more complicated, and he didn't press it. Tomorrow, she repeated, early. Trail's going to be icy, and I want to be through the worst of it before midday warmth starts moving things. She nodded. She sat back down. She looked at her cards, and then at May, and then back at her cards. Your turn, May said. Vivian played her card. May studied it. A small smile crossed May's face that Silas recognized as the smile of someone who has just seen exactly the move they were hoping the other person would make. Papa, May said, without looking up from the game. Is she going to come back? Silas was at the fire. He didn't answer right away. I don't know, May, he said. Vivian, May said, looking up at her. Are you going to come back? Vivian looked at the child across the table and then up at Silas, and the complicated thing was still in her expression. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know what happens after tomorrow. May considered this with the gravity she brought to serious questions. Then she looked down at the cards again. "Well," she said, "you know where we are." She played her next card, and whatever it did to the game, it made Vivian look at her hand and then set it face down on the table and make a sound that was, unmistakably, a short, surprised laugh. The first one Silas had heard from her. It was not a polished sound. It was the laugh of someone who had forgotten they still could. He turned back to the fire and said nothing, but in his chest something shifted the way ice shifts in early spring. Not breaking, not dramatic, just a slow, quiet loosening of what had been held tight for a long time. Outside, the mountain stood clean and white under the clearing sky. The storm was done. Tomorrow the trail would be passable, and Vivian Ashcroft would go back to her world, and Silas Boone would go back to his. The gap between those worlds was real and wide, and neither of them had said a word about it because there was nothing sensible to say. But tonight, there was a fire, and a card game, and the sound of his daughter's voice, and a woman who had survived 4 nights alone in a Colorado winter and come out of it, improbably, still able to laugh at a 7-year-old's card trick. Silas looked at the fire. It was enough, for tonight. It was more than enough. What he couldn't know, what neither of them could know, was that the world they were walking back toward was not the same world they had left. Edmund Ashcroft had spent 3 days in the particular darkness of a man who has accepted the worst, and that kind of darkness leaves marks that don't come out in the wash. And the reunion waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain was not going to be the clean, grateful thing that reunions were supposed to be. There were things Edmund Ashcroft had said in those 3 days. Things he had said about the mountain, and about the men who lived on it, and about what a daughter owed her father. Things that had been said in grief and in anger, which didn't make them less said. But that was tomorrow's wait. Tonight, Silas fed the fire and let his daughter win her card game, and outside the mountain stood still and cold and full of its own particular silences, keeping its own counsel. As it always had. They left the cabin before sunrise. Silas had them up and moving while the sky was still the deep indigo that precedes dawn, because he wanted the first hour of the trail done before the temperature started its midday shifts and made the ice unpredictable. He gave Vivian his spare pair of wool socks, doubled over her own, and wrapped her boots in strips of oilcloth he tied at the ankle with cord. It was not elegant. It worked. May was quiet in the mornings as a rule, not sullen, but self-contained, moving through her routine with the focused economy of someone who has learned that the world before breakfast requires a certain conservation of energy. She ate her portion, helped Silas bank the fire properly so the cabin wouldn't be a hazard while they were gone, and then stood at the door with her pack on and waited without being told to. Vivian watched all of this. She had her traveling coat back, dried and brushed as well as Silas had been able to manage, though it would never quite recover its original shape. She stood with it buttoned to the throat and looked at the cabin. The low ceiling, the rough-hewn table, the curtain May had embroidered herself along the bottom edge, with a pattern that was recognizably flowers if you were generous about it. And she looked at it the way people look at places they are trying to memorize without admitting to themselves that's what they're doing. "Ready?" Silas said. "Yes," she said. And then, before he could turn for the door, "Thank you for this, for all of it." She stopped. Whatever else she had meant to say didn't quite make it out, but it was there in the stop itself, in the slight compression of her expression. Silas nodded once. He opened the door and they went out into the cold. The trail down was harder on Vivian than she let herself show, which he noticed and said nothing about because saying something would have made it worse. Her body had spent 4 nights in a canyon and 2 days recovering in a cabin, and it had not had enough time for either of those things to be fully resolved, and the mountain did not care about that. The mountain was simply what it was, icy in the exposed stretches, deceptively soft in the places where new snow covered old ice, and navigating it required a particular kind of physical attention that her body kept struggling to sustain. She fell twice in the first hour. The first time she went down on one knee and was back up before Silas had finished turning around, and she looked at him with an expression that dared him to comment. He didn't. The second time was worse. She hit a patch of black ice on a curve where the trail narrowed and went down hard on her side, and this time she didn't get up immediately, and he saw her press her eyes closed for a moment against something that might have been pain or might have been something less physical. He reached down. She looked at his hand for a beat, and then she took it, and he pulled her up, and they kept moving. May, ahead of them on the trail, pretended not to have seen. They were maybe two-thirds of the way down, in the section of trail that ran through a stand of old-growth pine where the canopy had kept the worst of the ice off the ground, when they heard it. Voices, coming up. More than one. Then hoofbeats, muffled by snow, moving carefully. Silas stopped. Vivian stopped behind him. Around a bend in the trail, 3 riders appeared. The one in front was a man Silas recognized by type before he recognized by face. The kind of man who had been sitting still for too long and had finally run out of the discipline to keep doing it. I was maybe 60, broad through the chest, with a silver-streaked beard that hadn't been tended to in days. He was riding a horse that was too good for this terrain, being pushed too hard for these conditions, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been running on borrowed composure for a long time and has just spent the last of it. He saw Vivian and stopped breathing. Then he made a sound that Silas had heard once before, a long time ago, in a different context entirely. The specific involuntary sound a person makes when something they had given up on turns out to still exist. It was not a word. It was below words. "Papa," Vivian said. Edmund Ashcroft was off his horse before anyone could have stopped him, moving through the snow with a speed that his age and the conditions had no right to allow. And then Vivian was in his arms, and he was holding her the way a man holds something he thought was gone forever, which is different from how you hold anything else. Tighter, shaking, slightly. His face pressed against the top of her head. Silas stood back. May moved to his side without being directed to. The 2 riders who had come up with Edmund stayed on their horses, and one of them, a younger man with a sheriff's badge that Silas could see even from this distance, looked at Silas with an expression that was trying to figure out what to do with what it was looking at. The reunion lasted as long as it lasted. Silas did not time it. He stood in the cold with his daughter next to him and watched the snow in the trees and let it be what it was. When Edmund finally pulled back from Vivian, he held her by both shoulders and looked at her the way you look at something you need to verify is real. Her face, her eyes, the cut above her brow, which made his jaw tighten visibly. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm all right," she said. "It looks worse than it is." "You need a doctor." "I know. I'm all right, Papa." He looked at her for another long moment, and then, slowly, his head turned. He found Silas standing a few feet away, and the expression that moved across Edmund Ashcroft's face in that moment was one Silas would think about for a long time afterward. It was complicated in the way that powerful men's faces go complicated when they are confronted with a debt they haven't decided yet how to handle. Edmund released Vivian's shoulders. He straightened. He walked towards Silas with his hand already extended, and Silas shook it, and Edmund held on for a moment longer than a standard handshake required. "Mr. Boone," Edmund said. Silas looked at him. "Mr. Ashcroft, I owe you a debt I don't have words for." Edmund's voice was rough in the way of a man who has been using it to hold himself together for too long. "My daughter is alive because of you. That is—" He stopped. Started again. "Name your price. Whatever you need, whatever you want, whatever it costs to make this right." Silas said, "There's no price." Edmund blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I said there's no price." He said it without edge, without performance, just saying it. "Your daughter is alive. That's the whole thing. There's nothing to settle beyond that." Edmund stared at him. He was not a man who encountered this particular response often, possibly ever, and his face showed the difficulty of processing it. "Mr. Boone, you saved her life. You risked your own. You kept her for 3 days in—" He gestured vaguely upward, at the mountain, at all of it. "I'm not going to walk away from that without—" "You're not walking away from anything," Silas said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you there's no price because saving a person's life isn't a transaction. It's not something that gets settled." A pause. "She needed help. I helped. That's the end of the accounting." Edmund looked at him for a long, strange moment. Then he looked at Vivian, who was watching Silas with an expression that was quiet and not entirely readable. Then he looked back at Silas. "I don't understand you," Edmund said, and there was something almost confrontational in it. The frank irritation of a man whose framework for the world has just failed to account for something in front of him. "That's all right," Silas said. Edmund's jaw moved. It's not all right. A man saves my daughter's life. He deserves a handshake and a good morning, Silas said, which you've already given him. So we're square. The silence that followed that was the kind that has weather in it. Edmund Ashcroft was not accustomed to being told things were square when he had not yet determined that they were square. He was not accustomed to having the terms set by someone else, and the effort it cost him not to push back was visible in the set of his shoulders, in the way his chin lifted slightly. It was Vivian who broke it. "Papa," she said from behind him. She said it the way she might say it to a man standing at the edge of something he might not be able to step back from. Edmund looked at her. Something passed between them. The particular communication of two people who have known each other long enough that whole conversations can happen in the space of a look. Then Edmund breathed out slowly and turned back to Silas with something different in his expression. Still complicated, still not fully resolved, but different. "Then I thank you," Edmund said, without qualification, and without further argument, since that appears to be what you require. "It is," Silas agreed. Edmund nodded once, stiffly, the nod of a man who has conceded something he doesn't entirely know how to concede. Then he turned back to Vivian and took her arm with a careful, proprietary concern that was clearly second nature to him, steering her toward the horses. Silas watched them go. May watched them too. "He's angry," May said quietly, close to Silas's side. "He's relieved," Silas said. "Sometimes they look the same." May thought about this. "He wanted to give you money." "He did." "Why didn't you take it?" Silas looked down at her. She was looking up at him with her honest face, the one that wanted an actual answer rather than a deflection, which was the only face she really had. "Because if I take money for it," he said, "then it becomes a different thing than what it was. And I don't want it to be a different thing." He paused. "Does that make sense?" May considered. "Sort of," she said, which for May meant it made more sense than she currently had words for. They went down the rest of the trail. Silas had his own horse stabled at the relay station at the base of the mountain, and they went there first to see to it, while Edmund's people settled Vivian into the station itself, and the man who functioned as Edmund's personal physician, who had apparently been brought up from Denver and waiting at the station for 2 days, was summoned to examine her. Silas was in the stable with Henry the mule, checking him over after the days away, when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. "She's going to be fine," Edmund Ashcroft's voice. "The doctor says the frostbite damage is minimal. The cut on her head is superficial. She needs rest and real food and warmth, but she'll recover fully." "Good," Silas said. A pause. Edmund came further into the stable. He moved like a man who is more comfortable in boardrooms than barns, slightly careful about where he was putting his feet. But he moved with the deliberateness of someone who had decided he was going to do this, whether it was comfortable or not. "I want to say something to you," Edmund said, "and I want to say it without an audience." Silas turned around. Edmund was looking at him directly, and the complicated thing in his expression had been stripped back to something simpler, which in some ways was harder to look at. "I had your daughter," Edmund said. He said it badly, the syntax wrong, and then he corrected himself. "I mean, I heard about you. When they told me who had found her, one of Haskell's men knew your name. He told me about you." A pause. "He told me you were a trapper, a widower, that you were raising a daughter alone up here." Silas waited. "I said something," Edmund said, "in the camp, in those 3 days, to Haskell, about the kind of men who lived on these mountains." He stopped. The pause was long enough to have its own weather. "I said things I should not have said, things that—" He stopped again, breathed. "Things that were small and ignorant and that I said because I was a man who had spent 3 days being told his daughter was dead, and I needed somewhere to put the anger, and I put it in a direction that was not fair and not accurate and not remotely sufficient to the situation." Silas looked at him. He didn't make it easy by saying anything. "I don't ask forgiveness for it," Edmund said. "That's not what this is. I just—" He made a gesture, short and frustrated, the gesture of a man who is better with numbers and structures than with the architecture of an apology. "I wanted you to know that whatever I said about men like you, the man standing in front of me has done something that I am not capable of doing. Not because of the physical part, because of the part where you saw something that 50 trained men missed, and you did not let yourself walk away from it. He paused. That is not a small thing. And I said small things, and I know the difference. The stable was quiet except for Henry shifting his weight and the wind working at the gap in the roof that Silas had been meaning to patch since October. I appreciate that, Silas said finally. I'm not looking for— I know, Silas said. I'm not giving you absolution. I'm just telling you I appreciate you saying it. He paused. We were both doing the best we could with what we had. I had the mountain. You had nothing but waiting. Those aren't the same situation, and I'm not going to pretend I know what yours felt like. Edmund looked at him with an expression that was very different from the one he'd had on the trail. Still careful. Still not entirely comfortable, but different. Haskell's man said you'd refuse the reward, Edmund said. Word travels. He said you didn't even hesitate. There was nothing to hesitate about. Edmund was quiet for a moment. I want to do something, he said. Not payment, not a transaction, something— He stopped, his mouth pressed together. I want to send books. For your daughter. I have a contact in Denver who supplies schools. I want to send a box of proper books for her. Silas was quiet. She's clearly got a mind, Edmund said, and there was something genuine in it, something that wasn't about the negotiation of debt. A child like that needs books. Silas thought about May at the table with Vivian the previous 2 days. He thought about the questions she asked that he didn't have good answers for. He thought about the look on her face when she was working through something that interested her, the particular focus of it. She'd like that, he said. Edmund nodded. Then it's done. He paused. And the roof in this stable has a gap in it. The wind is coming through badly. I know. I have men in Cedar Fork who do structural work. I'd like to send 2 of them up in the spring. That's not a transaction, Edmund said firmly. A neighborly gesture. You're my neighbor on this mountain now, Mr. Boone, whether either of us chose that. Something moved across his face. Let a man do something with his hands that isn't just writing checks. My foreman will hate having nothing to do over the spring months. Silas looked at the gap in the roof. He thought about the 3 winters it had been bothering him. He thought about how it would bother him for another 3 if he let pride make the decision. All right, he said. Edmund extended his hand again. This time the handshake was different. Both of them felt the difference without naming it. That afternoon, the relay station filled with the particular energy of a situation being resolved by people who are very good at resolving situations. Edmund's people moved around Vivian with practiced efficiency. The doctor completing his examination, arrangements being made for a proper coach back to Denver, telegrams sent to various parties who had been waiting for news. The sheriff's deputy wrote up a report that Silas was required to speak to briefly, which he did in as few words as possible, and the deputy did not push for more. Through all of it, Vivian sat at a table by the window and watched the mountain. Silas came into the station to warm up and get something to eat before the ride back up to his cabin, and he found her there, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, and her eyes fixed on the upper slopes with an expression he recognized without being able to name. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was not something he would have done a week ago with a woman he didn't know. She didn't seem to mind. How's the head? He said. Manageable. She turned from the window. How long will you stay down here? Just today. I need to get back before dark. She nodded. Her hands were around the cup, absorbing its warmth. The right one, he noticed, still had a slight curl to it that hadn't been there before. Some stiffness in the tendons from the cold that the doctor had noted and said would likely resolve in a few weeks. I owe you an honesty, she said. He waited. When I was in the canyon, she said, on the 3rd night, when I stopped hearing the search party. She paused. I made a decision. She said it carefully, feeling for the words. Not a decision to give up, exactly. More like a decision to stop waiting for something that wasn't coming and to be with what was. A pause. I thought about my father, about how he would handle it, and I realized that what I was doing, waiting to be rescued, holding myself in suspension, was what he would do. Hold on until something external changed, and it didn't. She stopped. It wasn't working, so I stopped. And started thinking about the overhang, Silas said. She looked at him. Yes, about what was actually in front of me instead of what I wanted to be in front of me. She paused. I've never done that before. In 24 years, I don't think I've ever done that. Takes practice, he said. You've had a lot of it. 11 years of it, he agreed. And I'm still not particularly good at it. I just run out of alternatives faster than I used to. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Is that what happened on the mountain? You ran out of alternatives to going up? Something like that. She looked at him for a moment. You told me last night that you took the risk because of what you wanted May to see you do. That was honest. It was. There wasn't anything else in it? Just May? He held her eyes. There was also the fact that the possibility existed, he said, that you were still alive. And I find it very hard to walk away from a possibility when I haven't confirmed what it is. Even at risk to yourself. I'm not sure that's a virtue, he said. Clara would have told you it was the opposite. She would have told you it was stubbornness dressed up as bravery, and she would have been at least partly right. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then, your wife sounds like she was remarkable. She was stubborn in a different direction than I was, he said. Hers was the more useful direction. She was stubborn about people, about seeing them the way they actually were rather than the way they presented themselves. She could see through things I couldn't see through. He paused. May got that. That's where it came from. Vivian looked toward the corner of the station where May was currently in conversation with one of Edmund's men, a young man who looked thoroughly outmatched by whatever question she was currently asking him. She asked me, the first morning, if I was going to come back, Vivian said. I know. I told her I didn't know what was going to happen after we came down. I know, he said again. She looked at him. What do you think is going to happen? The question sat between them. He understood what it contained and what it didn't contain. It was not a simple question about itineraries or social arrangements. It was the question you ask when you are standing at the edge of one version of your life and can see the outline of another one and are not sure yet whether the gap between them is crossable. He was not a man who gave answers he wasn't sure of. I think, he said slowly, that you're going to go back to Denver with your father and recover. And there are going to be a lot of people who want a lot of things from you, and it's going to take some time to sort out what you actually want from what everyone else has decided you should want. He paused. And I think the mountain will be here while you're sorting it out. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a careful answer. It's an honest one. She looked at her tea. She picked it up and drank from it, even though it had gone cold, which was something he had noticed she did. She didn't stop drinking things when they went cold. She just drank them at whatever temperature they happened to be, which he had decided was either very practical or very stubborn, and possibly both. My father is going to have opinions, she said. He seems like a man with opinions. He has opinions about where I live and who I associate with and what my life should look like. She said it without bitterness, just reporting a fact. He's been having those opinions for 24 years. He's very good at them. What do you think about his opinions? I think they come from a place that is genuinely about me, she said, not just about control or status or what looks right. He actually believes the life he wants for me is the best life for me. She paused. He's wrong, but his motives are real, which makes it more complicated than if he were just selfish. Silas thought about that. That's a generous read. I've had 4 days in a canyon to think about the people I love clearly, she said. It produces a certain honesty. He was quiet. He's not a bad man, she said. He's a man who built everything he has by being certain, and certainty becomes a habit, and the habit doesn't distinguish between business decisions and people. She paused. He looked at you today and saw someone who had done something he couldn't categorize, and it frightened him. And his first response to being frightened is to try to purchase control of the thing that frightened him. He figured out it wouldn't work, Silas said. He did, which is not nothing. She looked at the window again, at the mountain. He figured it out because you didn't react the way people usually react to him. He expects either deference or antagonism. You gave him neither. I gave him a handshake. You gave him the experience of being met as an equal by someone who had no incentive to do so, she said. Do you know how rarely that happens to a man like my father? A pause. I watched his face when you turned down the money. He didn't know what to do with it, and not knowing what to do with something is the most educational experience he's capable of having. Silas sat with that for a moment. You think about him a lot. He's my father, she said simply. And I've spent 24 years trying to understand him well enough to be fair to him while also being true to myself. That's an ongoing project. A pause. He's not the same man he was when I was 10. Neither am I. We just... She stopped. We haven't quite caught up to who we're each becoming. We keep reacting to the old versions. Edmund himself appeared at the station door at that moment, speaking with the doctor, and Vivian watched him with the expression of someone who has just been articulating something complicated and is now observing the actual subject of it in a different light. Edmund said something that made the doctor nod and write something down. He had a quality, even now, even after the days he'd had, of a man who had things moving in the direction he pointed them. It was not an entirely comfortable quality to be around, Silas thought, but it was real. Edmund glanced over. His eyes went to Silas first, then to Vivian, then to their 2 cups and the angle of their conversation. His expression did not change exactly, but something in it registered. He came over. "Doctor wants you in Denver by tomorrow evening," he said to Vivian. "We'll leave at first light." "All right," she said. Edmund looked at Silas. Then he pulled out a chair, with the air of a man who sits where he chooses, and sat down. He set his hands on the table in front of him, palms down, the gesture of a man who is about to be straightforward about something. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said on the trail, about there being no price." He paused. "I understand what you meant. I don't entirely agree with the philosophy behind it. In my experience, refusing compensation has a way of creating more imbalance than accepting it does. But I understand the principle you were applying." He looked at Silas steadily. "What I can't reconcile is the question of why." "Why what?" Silas said. "Why you went up there? After 50 men came down. What you had to gain." Silas looked at him. "I told you. There was nothing to gain, that's the point." "There's always something," Edmund said. It wasn't cynicism, exactly. It was the statement of a man who had been operating on a particular premise for 60 years and had found it reliable. Recognition, self-worth, the sense of being the man who succeeded where others failed, something. "Maybe," Silas said. "I'm not going to argue I'm above all that. Maybe some of it was in there. I don't do a lot of internal accounting on my own motives." He paused. "But even if all of those things were in it, the fact that she needed help was still the main thing. The other stuff is just what was in the room with it." Edmund sat with that. He looked at Silas with the expression of a man whose framework was being asked to accommodate something that didn't quite fit its current dimensions. "You're a difficult man to understand," Edmund said. "I've been told," Silas said. "By who?" "That daughter of yours?" "Among others." Edmund's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. Not yet. But it was the structure that a smile could come from later, when the occasion was right and the distance had narrowed enough. "She is something," he said. "Your May." "She is," Silas agreed. "She told me, while you were in the stable, she walked up to me entirely without introduction, and told me that her father had taken her mother's ring off the shelf this morning before we left and put it in his coat pocket. She seemed to feel I should know that." A pause. "I don't know what I was meant to do with that information." Silas went very still. He thought about the shelf above the fireplace where Clara's ring had sat for 3 years. He thought about the morning's rush, the pre-dawn dark, the deliberate automation of his movements. He thought about his hand stopping at the shelf without his mind having made a decision. He said nothing. Edmund watched him, and something in the watching was less assessing than it had been before. More patient. "I don't know what it means either," Edmund said after a moment. "I'm just reporting what your daughter told me." A pause. "She's very clear on what she thinks is important information." "She always has been," Silas said, in a voice that came out slightly unsteady, in a way he couldn't entirely control, and he cleared his throat and looked at the table. Vivian was looking at him. He didn't look back at her. He looked at the table for a moment, then at the window, then at his hands. "I should head back up," he said, "before the light goes." He stood. Edmund stood reflexively. They looked at each other across the table. "Spring," Edmund said. "I'll send the men in spring, for the roof." "I know," Silas said. "I'll leave the latch off the stable." He went to find May, who was still in conversation with Edmund's beleaguered employee, and who took leave of that conversation with the air of someone who had gotten what she needed from it and was now prepared to move on. She fell into step beside Silas without fanfare, her pack on her back, her boots leaving small, clean prints in the dust of the station floor. At the door, Silas stopped and looked back. Vivian was still at the table. She had turned to watch him go, and she was not pretending not to, which was one of the things he had noticed about her. She did not pretend about the things she was actually doing. She looked at him from across the room and he looked back. And it was not a long look. It was maybe 4 seconds from start to finish. And it did not resolve anything, and it was not meant to. But it was honest. And in his experience, honest was the thing worth holding on to. He turned and pushed the door open and walked out into the late afternoon cold with his daughter beside him and the mountain above him and the ring in his coat pocket pressing its small, specific weight against his ribs with every step. May walked beside him in silence for a while. Then she said, without looking up, "She's going to come back." Silas kept walking. "You don't know that." "I know," May said. He didn't argue. He had learned in 7 years that certain things May said in that particular tone were not predictions so much as observations made slightly ahead of the evidence, and that arguing with them was a way of losing twice. They walked up through the late light, the mountain quiet around them, the trail familiar under his feet. Behind them, at the base of the mountain, Edmund Ashcroft was making arrangements and giving instructions and doing what Edmund Ashcroft did. And in the spring, 2 men would come up from Cedar Fork to fix a roof, and a box of books would arrive for a 7-year-old who already read better than most adults Silas knew. And the mountain would be here, as he had said, waiting in the particular patient way of things that have no need to hurry. The books arrived in April. A box of them, strapped to the back of a mule, led up by one of Edmund's Cedar Fork men, a quiet fellow named Garrett, who had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors and was entirely comfortable with silence. He handed the box to Silas without ceremony, said the 2 roofmen would be up the following week, and turned around and went back down the mountain. May opened the box with the focused intensity she brought to anything she considered serious. She pulled each book out individually, read the title and the first page standing right there in the cabin doorway, with the spring light coming in cold and clean behind her, and then set it in a pile she was apparently organizing by some system of her own that Silas did not inquire about. When she got to the bottom of the box, she went back through the whole pile again from the beginning, more slowly this time. Then she looked up at Silas and said, "She picked these." Silas was at the table. "Garrett said they came from Mr. Ashcroft's." "She picked them," May said again, with the certainty she used when she was not proposing a theory, but reporting a fact. She held up a book with a dark green cover. "This one has a note in it." He took it. A folded piece of paper had been tucked inside the front cover, and the handwriting on it was not Edmund Ashcroft's. He had seen Edmund's handwriting on a letter that had arrived in February, formal and slightly angular, the penmanship of a man educated in an era when penmanship was considered a character attribute. This was different, looser, the letters of someone who wrote quickly and thought faster than the pen. It said, "May, I have been informed that you are exceptionally good at cards. I thought you should also be exceptionally well read. These are the ones I wish I'd had at 7. Silas read it twice. He handed it back to May, who read it herself, then held it against her chest with the book, both hands flat across the cover. "She's coming back," May said. He went to the window. Outside, the snow was retreating up the mountain in the slow, unglamorous way of seasonal change. Not a dramatic melt, but a gradual recession, patches of brown earth appearing where there had been white, the lower trail turning to mud that would take another month to properly firm up. Somewhere in those lower elevations, spring was already happening. Up here it was still deciding. "We'll see," he said. But he had read the note, and he had heard in it the same thing May had heard, which was a person talking to someone she intended to continue knowing. He didn't say that. He went back to his work. Vivian came back in May. She didn't send word ahead, which he had not expected, and which was either entirely in character for the woman he'd spent 3 days with, or entirely out of character for the life she'd gone back to. He wasn't sure which yet. He heard the horse on the trail before he saw her, because the trail to his cabin was one he knew by its sounds, and he was splitting wood behind the cabin when the rhythm of the hoofbeats told him someone was coming who knew how to ride. She came around the side of the cabin on a gray horse he didn't recognize, wearing clothes that were practical rather than fashionable. Heavy wool coat, proper riding boots, her hair pulled back simply. The cut above her brow had healed to a thin scar that would probably stay. She looked at him over the horse's neck, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You didn't send word," he said. "I wasn't sure I'd actually come until I was already part way up," she said, which was honest enough that he didn't push it. He helped her with the horse, and they went inside and he put water on for coffee, because it was what he had, and she sat at the table in the same chair she'd used during the storm and looked around the cabin the way she had looked at it the morning they left, like she was checking that it was still what she remembered. "May's at the Calloway place," he said. "Ruth Calloway has been teaching her to bake, which May tolerates because Ruth also has a large personal library and has told her she can borrow from it." Vivian's mouth moved. A fair trade. May thinks so. He brought the coffee and sat across from her, and they were quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind and the uncomfortable kind mixed together, because they were two people who had been through something together and then been separated for 4 months and were now figuring out what category the other person was in. "How's your hand?" he said. She flexed it against the mug. "Mostly back, some stiffness in the cold still. Doctor says it'll resolve." "Good." "My father sent a full report on you," she said. "Had someone look into your background, your time in Missouri before you came here, your marriage, your wife's death." A pause. "He wanted to know who you were." Silas looked at her steadily. "Did you read it?" "No," she said. "I told him I wasn't interested in what a report said about you. I'd rather know what you say about yourself." She held his eyes. "When you're inclined to say anything at all, which I understand is not frequently." He looked at the table, then back at her. "What's he say about me now, your father?" "He says you're either a very simple man or a very complicated one, and he can't determine which." She paused. "I told him those weren't actually different things." "What did he say to that?" "He said I was getting mountain philosophy into my otherwise reasonable mind, and he'd appreciate it if I'd come back to Denver and attend some dinners." "And?" "And I told him I'd think about it." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I've been thinking about it for 4 months. That's what I've been doing mostly. Thinking about the right question to ask instead of just answering the questions everyone else has been presenting me with." He waited. "I grew up being prepared for a certain kind of life," she said. "Educated for it, dressed for it, introduced to the right people for it. And I was good at it. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't unhappy, exactly. I was competent at the version of myself that was expected. And there's a satisfaction in competence even when the thing you're competent at isn't what you would have chosen." She paused. "But 4 nights in that canyon?" She stopped, breathed. "What I found out about myself in that canyon was not that I was brave. I don't know if I was brave. What I found out was that when there was nothing left but what I actually was, no presentation, no context, no structure, the thing that was left was useful. It functioned. It found the overhang and stayed in it and kept breathing." She looked at him. "And I'd like to keep being that person. I don't want to go back to the other one." Silas said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about what she'd said, turning it over, not as a response, but as something he wanted to actually understand. "They're not different people," he said finally. "The one who survived the canyon and the one who knew which fork to use at dinner. They're both you." She looked at him. "You sound very certain about that." "I'm not particularly, but I've watched May try to separate out the parts of herself she got from her mother and the parts she grew herself, and she can't do it, and I think that's not a failure of effort. I think it's that they're the same thing." Vivian was quiet. "What are you actually asking?" he said. She looked at him, then she looked at her coffee, then back at him, and this time she left whatever was underneath the expression visible rather than managing it. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer. I came up here because I needed to be in a place where the question didn't already have an expected answer, and this is the only place I've found where that's true." He sat with that. Outside, a bird was doing something persistent and loud in the pine tree at the corner of the cabin, and the light was the particular clear quality of a mountain morning in May, when the air had cleaned itself out over the winter and everything was sharply itself rather than muffled. "You can stay," he said. "A few days, if you want to think." She looked at him. "May will be glad," he said. "She has things to say to you about the books." "I imagine she does," Vivian said, and the thing that moved across her face when she said it was not complicated. It was just real. She stayed 4 days. And then she went back down. And then she came back at the end of the month. And then she stayed longer. This was how it went through the summer. Not a decision made cleanly in one moment, but a series of smaller decisions accumulating in one direction, the way water finds its way through ground that is gradually becoming permeable. Silas noticed the pattern and said nothing about it, because naming the pattern felt like the kind of thing that would make it self-conscious, and self-conscious was the thing most likely to break it. May noticed it too, with her usual complete accuracy, and exercised an uncharacteristic discretion about it that suggested she understood, on some level, that this particular situation required a lighter hand than most. The first real trouble came in September, which Silas should have expected but hadn't, not in the specific form it took. It was Edmund. He arrived on a Monday, without Garrett or any of the Cedar Fork men, which was the first sign that something was different. He came up alone on the same horse he'd been riding the day they'd come down off the mountain, and he rode it with the same slight carelessness for terrain that Silas had noticed before. Not reckless, just inattentive, the way people are inattentive to things they haven't been trained to respect. Silas saw him coming from the ridge where he'd been checking the upper trap lines and recognized him by the horse before he could see the man clearly. He came down and was at the cabin when Edmund arrived, and something in Edmund's face when he dismounted told Silas that this was not a social visit. Edmund looked older than he had in January. Not dramatically, not the aging of years, but the aging of something more specific. The erosion that comes from a sustained difficulty. His coat was good, but had been traveled in hard, and there was a quality to his movements that was less certain than Silas remembered. Not physically. Something else. "Mr. Ashcroft," Silas said. "Boone." Edmund didn't extend his hand right away. He stood with his horse's reins in one hand and looked at the cabin and then at Silas. "Is Vivian here?" "She went down to Cedar Fork this morning," Silas said. "She'll be back this evening." Edmund nodded. He looked at the cabin again, and this time Silas saw what he was actually looking at, the evidence of Vivian in the place. Her coat on the hook by the door, the books stacked on the table with a ribbon marking one of them, which was not May's ribbon and not Silas's. The small pot of something she'd been growing in the window, some herb she'd had May help her plant from seed, that neither of them had managed to kill yet. "She's here a great deal," Edmund said. It was not a question. "She comes and goes," Silas said. "I know she comes and goes. I've been watching her come and go all summer." Edmund's jaw tightened. "I'd like to come in." Silas stepped aside. Edmund came into the cabin and stood in the middle of it, and Silas could see him taking it in with the particular discomfort of a man who has been imagining a place and found the reality of it harder to dismiss than the imagination. "Sit down," Silas said. Edmund sat, in the chair Vivian usually used, without appearing to notice. Silas made coffee that Edmund didn't ask for and put it in front of him anyway, and sat across from him and waited. "I'm going to be direct with you," Edmund said. "Good," Silas said. "Vivian has spent more time on this mountain this summer than she has in Denver. She has declined 3 social engagements that she would previously have considered important. She has told me twice that she is reconsidering the structure of her life." Edmund paused. "And she won't tell me what she's reconsidering it in favor of." "Did you ask her?" "I asked her. She said she was still working it out." "Then she probably is," Silas said. Edmund's eyes were on him, steady and assessing. "I want to know your intentions toward my daughter, Mr. Boone." Silas held his gaze. "That's a question you should ask Vivian. I'm asking you." "I understand that. I'm still telling you it's the wrong question, asked of the wrong person." Edmund's expression stiffened. "She is my daughter. She is 24 years old, and she has spent her entire life being built toward a certain kind of future. And what I see when I look at the evidence of this summer is—" He stopped. "I need to know what this is." "You need to know," Silas said. "Or you need to be able to manage it?" The silence that landed on that was sharp. Edmund sat back in his chair. His hands were flat on the table and his jaw was working, and Silas could see the effort it cost him not to respond with the full weight of who he was in most rooms. He was a man who was used to being the largest force in any given space, and this cabin was not a room that had any particular relationship to that. "I don't mean it as an insult," Silas said. "Not an apology, just a clarification. I mean that those are 2 different needs, and they require 2 different things. If you need to know what this is because you're worried about her, Whether she's making decisions from clarity or from some aftermath of what happened in January, then that's a real concern and it deserves a real answer. If you need to manage it because you have a plan for her life and this doesn't fit the plan, then that's something else. Edmund looked at him for a long moment. And if it's both? Then we should separate them, Silas said, because they won't get resolved together. Edmund was quiet. He picked up the coffee and drank from it, not because he wanted the coffee, but because it gave him somewhere to put his hands. He looked at the window, at the mountain visible through it, at the herb in the pot on the sill. She's different, Edmund said finally, quietly. Since January, she's still herself, but there's something underneath it that wasn't there before, or that was there but not visible. He paused. She argues with me now. She has always been respectful, always been... He stopped. She argues with me now, on specifics, with a clarity that she didn't used to have. Is that bad? Silas said. Edmund looked at him. It's disorienting, he said, and the honesty of it seemed to cost him something, but he left it out there. She told me in February that I had been making decisions on her behalf because it was easier than making them for myself, since my own life had been fully determined for 30 years and hers was still open. She said it very calmly, like she had thought about it for a long time and was simply reporting a conclusion. A pause. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. Silas said nothing. Was she right? Edmund asked. And the asking of it was the most unguarded thing Silas had seen from him. I don't know you well enough to say, Silas said, but she knows you very well, and she's not someone who reports conclusions she hasn't earned. Edmund breathed out. He looked at his hands. No, she isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Her mother was like that. Vivian's mother. She had that same... He stopped. She died when Vivian was 11. I've been making decisions for Vivian since then that were really about not losing her too, about keeping her close in a life I could see clearly. His mouth tightened. I am aware, Mr. Boone, that this is not a noble motivation. It's a human one, Silas said. Edmund looked at him. You don't have to be better than human, Silas said. You just have to be honest about which parts of what you want are for her and which parts are for you. She can work with honesty. She's been working around the other thing for years. The door opened. May came in from the side trail, her boots muddy and her hair escaping its braid in several directions, which was her normal state by mid-afternoon. She saw Edmund and stopped. Mr. Ashcroft, she said, not alarmed, just noting. May, Edmund said. He looked at her the way he had at the relay station, with a quality that was different from how he looked at most people, slightly caught off guard by what she was. Are you staying for supper? May asked. Edmund looked at Silas. Ruth Calloway sent a chicken up with May, Silas said. There's enough. Edmund looked at the table. He looked at the chair he was sitting in. He looked at May, who was waiting for an answer with the patient, slightly assessing quality of a child who has already decided she will accept either answer, but wants to know which it is. All right, he said. May nodded and took her boots off at the door and went about her business with the chicken. Silas fed the fire. Edmund sat at the table and watched a 7-year-old move around a mountain cabin with the competence of someone twice her age, and something in his expression shifted very slowly, the way things shift when the evidence in front of you is adjusting a conclusion you'd reached without quite enough data. Vivian arrived back from Cedar Fork at dusk, coming through the door with cold air and a paper-wrapped package that turned out to be something she'd found at the dry goods store and wanted May to see. She was already talking before she was fully in the room. May? They had the most peculiar thing. Somebody had left a whole set of... And then she stopped. She saw her father. The moment lasted about 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, Silas watched 3 different things move across her face in rapid succession. The first was surprise. The second was something that resolved the surprise into wariness. The third was a kind of gathering, the way she had of pulling herself together into clarity before she spoke. Papa, she said. I came to see you, Edmund said. He stood up from the table. I should have sent word. I didn't. No, she agreed. You didn't. She looked at him carefully. She looked at Silas, then at May, reading whatever she could read in the room, then back at her father. How long have you been here? A few hours, Edmund said. We've been talking. About what? Edmund's jaw moved. About the difference between what I need to know and what I need to manage. Something happened in Vivian's expression. It was not quite surprise. It was more like the face of someone who has said a thing once to one person and has just discovered it has traveled further than they expected. She looked at Silas. He looked back at her neutral, giving her nothing she hadn't already given him to work with. She looked back at her father. "And which is this visit?" she asked. "Knowing or managing?" "I'm still determining that," Edmund said with an honesty that was clearly not natural to him, but that he was making himself use. "I came up here to tell you to come home. I had the argument organized. I knew what I was going to say." A pause. "And then I sat in this cabin for 2 hours, and I've been somewhat disorganized since." Vivian put the paper-wrapped package on the table. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook next to her other coat, and she stood there for a moment with her back to the room and her hands on the pegs. "I'm not coming home," she said to the coats. "Not to stay. Not the way you mean it." She turned around. Her eyes went to her father and stayed there, and whatever she'd been organizing on the way back from Cedar Fork was in them now, clear and present. "I know that's not what you want to hear. I know it doesn't fit the plan. I know there are people in Denver who are going to have opinions about it, and some of those opinions are going to reflect on you in ways that aren't comfortable." She paused. "I'm sorry for the discomfort. I'm not sorry for the decision." Edmund stood very still. "I'm not asking you to understand it right now," she said. "I'm just asking you to hear it, as what it actually is, which is me telling you something true, rather than as a problem to be solved." The kitchen was very quiet. May had stopped what she was doing, and she was looking at the fire with the focused non-attention of a child who is listening carefully and has decided the best way to keep listening is to appear not to be. Edmund looked at his daughter for a long time. His face was not easy to read in that moment. Too many things moving in it at once. The way a river surface shows you the wind and the current and the depth all simultaneously without showing you any of them cleanly. "I hear you," he said, finally, and said nothing else. The chicken was ready 20 minutes later, and they ate it at the table, all four of them, which was not something any of them had done before, and which had the particular quality of things happening for the first time. Slightly cautious, slightly tentative, with silences that nobody rushed to fill. Edmund ate with his coat still on, which Silas noticed and said nothing about. Because a man keeping his coat on at a meal was a man who had not yet decided how long he was staying, and that was his right. May told Edmund about the red-tailed hawk she had been watching for 3 weeks from the East Ridge, and about her theory regarding its hunting pattern. And Edmund listened to this with the careful attention he might have given to a business presentation, which was both slightly formal and genuinely respectful. He asked 2 questions that were good questions, which May acknowledged by pausing before she answered them, which was the closest she came to paying a compliment. After supper, Vivian and Edmund walked outside together. Silas watched them from the window. Not close, not for long, just enough to see the shape of it. 2 people standing in the early dark mountain air, one of them talking, and one of them listening, and then both of them talking, and then both of them standing in silence, looking up at the sky where the first stars were coming through. He turned away from the window. May was at the table with one of her books. She looked up at him. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked. Silas thought about it. "He's going to have to get used to some things," he said. "That takes time." "Is he going to be mean about it?" He looked at his daughter. In the firelight, she looked very much like Clara, not in the specific features, but in the quality of the expression, the directness of it, the refusal to pretend a question wasn't what it was. "He might be," Silas said, "for a while. People who are used to managing things and then can't manage a thing sometimes go mean before they go quiet. It doesn't mean they stay mean." May considered this. "You went quiet," she said. "After Mama. You didn't go mean." "I had you," he said. "Going mean wasn't an option I could afford." May looked at him with the expression she used for things she was going to think about for a long time. Then she looked back at her book. Edmund came back inside alone, a few minutes later. Vivian stayed out. He came in and stood near the fire with his hands behind his back, and Silas stayed at the table and let him have the fire. "She's stubborn," Edmund said to the fire. "She is," Silas agreed. "I wonder where she got it." He said it in a tone that could have been sarcastic, but wasn't, quite. More complicated than that. Probably from a man who built a railroad empire across 3 territories by the time he was 40, Silas said. Edmund glanced at him. The thing at the corner of his mouth this time was closer to the actual article. Don't flatter me, he said. Wasn't flattery, Silas said. Stubborn is usually a compliment, coming from me. Edmund looked at him. The fire snapped between them. Outside, through the window, Vivian was a dark shape against the mountain dark. Not moving, just standing, and from this distance she looked very small against everything behind her, and very certain of where she was standing. I'm going to need time, Edmund said. Not to Silas exactly, to the room, to the situation, to whatever was being asked of him. That's fair, Silas said. I'm not going to pretend this is what I wanted for her. You don't have to. But He stopped. His hands came out from behind his back and he looked at them, then let them drop. I looked at her just now and I saw her mother standing in the dark looking at stars. And her mother was never unhappy, standing in the dark looking at stars. I haven't thought about her like that in a long time. A pause, long enough to have weight. She used to tell me that I spent so much energy making sure the future was secure that I missed the fact that the present was good. A pause. I miss her. Silas said nothing. He let it sit. I miss her, Edmund said again, more quietly, in the voice of a man who has just said something he has not said out loud in a long time. He looked at the fire. I'm sorry, that's not... No, Silas said. It is. It's exactly... He stopped, breathed. Yeah. The fire between them did what fires do, which was nothing in particular, which was the right thing. May, at the table, had her eyes on her book, but her hands were still on the page and she hadn't turned it in a while. When Vivian came back inside, she looked at her father's face and then at Silas and seemed to understand, without requiring it to be explained, that something had happened in this room while she was outside. She didn't ask what. She went to the fire and stood next to her father, and after a moment he put his arm around her shoulders stiffly, the way people do when the gesture matters more than their ability to make it naturally. She leaned into it, just slightly. She didn't say anything either. Outside, the mountain held its cold and its silence and the vast indifferent dark that it had been holding for 1,000 years before any of them arrived, and would hold for 1,000 after. Inside the cabin, the fire burned medium and steady, exactly the way Silas preferred it. Not too hot, not dramatic, just enough to keep the cold where it belonged. Edmund stayed the night. He slept in May's curtained-off area because May insisted on this with a certainty that suggested she had decided it was the right configuration and was not open to alternate proposals, and she slept by the fire, which she said she preferred and which was possibly even true. In the morning he ate breakfast with them and then saddled his horse. He stood with it in the sharp early morning cold and looked at the cabin and at Vivian and at Silas and at May, who had come out to see him off with her coat pulled around her over her nightgown. I'll come back, he said. Not as a threat, as a statement of intention. I know, Vivian said. He looked at Silas. I'm going to have opinions, he said, about various things. I want you to know in advance that the opinions are not the whole of what I think. Silas looked at him steadily. Same, he said. Edmund nodded once. He mounted the horse with the slight care of a man whose joints were registering the cold morning, and he gathered the reins and he looked at all of them one more time from that height. May, he said. She looked up at him. The hawk, he said. Let me know what you find out about the hunting pattern. May studied him for a moment. Then she said, I will. He turned the horse and rode down the trail, and they stood and watched him until the tree line took him, and then the sounds of the horse faded and the mountain morning settled back in around them the way it always did, quiet and clear, and completely unimpressed with the human business that had just occurred within it. Vivian exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that has more than one thing in it. That went, she started. Better than expected, Silas said. I was going to say strangely, she said. But yes, also better than expected. She looked at him. Something in the look was the same thing that had been in the look at the relay station, at the table by the window, on the trail coming down off the mountain that first day. The careful, honest attention of someone who had decided that looking at things clearly was worth the discomfort of what you sometimes saw. He asked about your intentions, she said. He did. What did you say? I told him it was the wrong question asked of the wrong person. She was quiet for a moment. The early light was doing something specific to the mountain above them, the angle of it picking out the texture of the upper snowfields in a way that made them look three-dimensional rather than flat. She looked at it for a moment and then back at him. What's the right question? She said. May, between them, was looking at the trail her grandfather had just disappeared down. She appeared to be thinking about hawk hunting patterns. She appeared not to be listening to the adults. She was absolutely listening to the adults. Silas looked at Vivian in the morning light, in front of the cabin he had built himself 11 years ago, when the future had looked like one particular shape, and he thought about the ring in his coat pocket, which he'd put back on the shelf when they came down off the mountain, and then taken down again in March, without examining the decision too closely. The right question, he said, is probably the one that tells you what you actually want. Not what you're willing to settle for, not what makes sense from the outside. What you want. She looked at him. He looked back. Between them, something that had been taking its time reached what felt like a place where time was no longer quite the relevant variable. I'm still working on that one, she said. I know, he said. Take the time you need. The mountain's not going anywhere. She looked up at the mountain, and the expression on her face in that moment was not the expression she'd had when she was lying at the bottom of a ravine in January. It was not the expression of a woman who had survived something and was trying to remember who she was. It was the expression of someone who had found out who she was and was deciding what to do with the information. It was a good expression. It was one he could look at for a long time. Inside the cabin, the fire needed tending. May was already heading back through the door to tend it, her coat trailing, her mind on hawks and books, and whatever else was currently in progress in the busy interior of her particular 7-year-old mind. The morning was clear and cold and getting lighter by the minute, and the day was going to require the things that days on a mountain always required, and there would be time, later, for the questions that were still working themselves toward answers. There was time. For now, there was this: the mountain, the morning, and 3 people who had arrived at the same small cabin by completely different routes and found, against any reasonable probability, that it was large enough to hold them. The question Vivian had been working on answered itself in October. Not dramatically. Not in any single moment that could be pointed to afterward as the moment. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually and then all at once. And by the time you noticed it, you realized it had been true for a while before you gave it a name. She had come up in late September with 2 trunks this time instead of a saddlebag, and Silas had looked at the trunks and looked at her, and she had looked back at him with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was not going to be theatrical about it. I'm not going back to Denver, she said. Not to live. He looked at the trunks. He looked at her. All right, he said. That's all you're going to say? What else would I say? She stood there for a moment. Then she laughed, short and real, the same surprised laugh he'd first heard at the card table in January. And she picked up one of the trunks and carried it inside, and that was that. It was not, of course, that simple. Nothing that involves 2 people and a 7-year-old and a 60-year-old man in Denver who had opinions is ever that simple. But the decision itself was simple, which was something Vivian told Silas later that surprised her. She had expected it to feel complicated when it finally landed. It didn't. It felt like finding the overhang in the canyon. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just the specific relief of being in the right place when the weather was bad. Edmund's response to the news arrived by letter 10 days later. Silas was not present when Vivian read it, because he had the animals to see to, and the letter was hers. He came in from the stable, and she was at the table with it, and her expression told him what he needed to know about the general character of the letter without him having to ask. He's angry, she said. I know. He says I'm throwing away everything he built for me. She looked at the letter. He says I've been... He uses the word bewitched, which tells you something about the state he was in when he wrote it. She set the letter down. He's not wrong that he built things for me. He's wrong about the bewitching, and he's wrong about the throwing away. She paused. I tried to write that back to him. I'm not sure I found the right words. What did you say? I said that everything he gave me I still have. The education, the ability to think and to read and to engage with the world seriously, the stubbornness. She paused. I said the only thing I was setting down was the part that was his preference rather than mine, and that those were two different things, and I knew he couldn't see the difference yet, but I thought he would eventually. And? And I told him that the door of this cabin has always been open to him and would continue to be. She looked at Silas. I hope that's accurate. It is, he said. She nodded. She folded the letter and set it aside with the careful, deliberate movement of someone setting a thing in its proper place rather than away from sight. He'll come around, she said. It will take time and it will be uncomfortable and there will probably be more letters like this one before it gets better. But he'll come around. She said it with the same clarity she'd had when she told Silas about her father's motives, the view of someone who had thought about this particular person for a very long time. He came around on the mountain. He came around in the stable. The pattern is that he runs at things hard, and then he runs out of running, and he has to sit with what's actually in front of him. She paused. He needs the territory to stop changing long enough for him to map it. And right now the territory keeps changing, Silas said. I've given him a great deal to map this year, she agreed, with something in her voice that was not quite guilt but was adjacent to it. You've given him the truth, Silas said. That's not something you owe him an apology for. She looked at him. You're very certain about that. On that one, yeah, he said. I am. The letter that came back from Edmund 3 weeks after Vivian's response was different in tone from the first one. Still stiff. Still with the quality of a man who was measuring every word before he committed it to paper, which was not how Edmund talked in person, but was apparently how he wrote when he was trying to be careful. He said that he had reread Vivian's letter several times. He said that he understood she was not asking for his approval, but that he wanted to say, for the record, that he was trying to understand rather than simply oppose. He said the word bewitched had been poorly chosen and he withdrew it. He asked if May was well and said he had found a book he thought she might like about the migration patterns of birds of prey. Vivian read the letter aloud at the dinner table. May, when she heard the part about the book, said simply, "He's learning." Silas and Vivian looked at each other across the table, and neither of them laughed, but it was a close thing. The question of what Vivian called herself on this mountain, and what Silas was, in relation to her, moved slowly through the fall in the way of things that both people involved are handling carefully because they know it matters, and are not interested in handling it wrong. They were not careless people, either of them. They were both people who had been formed by loss in ways that made them slower to reach for things than they might otherwise have been, and faster to recognize what was real when they found it. The ring came down from the shelf for the last time on a Tuesday in November, when the first real winter was beginning to make itself felt in the upper elevations, and the aspens had been bare for 3 weeks, and May was inside doing her lessons at the table with the focused silence she brought to anything she considered serious. Silas took the ring off the shelf and turned it in his hand for a moment, looking at it in the gray morning light. It was a simple ring, plain silver, the kind of thing a man buys when he has more love than money, which was what he'd had at 28. Clara had worn it for 9 years. It had sat on the shelf for 3. He stood there with it in his palm for a long moment, not doing anything, just being with it, and with what it meant to have it in his hand and with what he intended. He was not a man who was good at declarations. He had never been that man. Clara had known this about him and had found it more amusing than frustrating, mostly because she understood that the words being hard for him did not mean the feeling behind them was anything less than the words in someone more articulate. He had proposed to her by accident, had started a sentence about their future, and gotten turned around and somehow ended up at a question he hadn't planned to ask yet, and she had said yes before he finished it, which had been both terrifying and the greatest relief of his life. He found Vivian outside by the woodpile, which was where she went sometimes when she was thinking. She had taken on the wood splitting in the mornings, which had surprised him until she told him that the physical simplicity of it helped her think, and then it made complete sense. She was not splitting wood at the moment. She was just standing near it, her breath making small white clouds in the cold air, looking at the mountain above the tree line where new snow had fallen overnight, and was sitting clean and bright in the thin November sun. She heard him come out and turned around. He held up the ring. He had planned, in the abstract way that a man who is not good at declarations plans things, to say something. Something real and specific. Something that was not a speech but was enough. Enough to say what it meant to have found her in that canyon, and what it had meant to watch her become sure of herself over the months since, and what it would mean to him and to May to have her stay. What came out was, "I'd like you to have this." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She knew what the ring was. He had told her about Clara's ring, in the way that things get told over months of close proximity, and she had a good memory, and he had not told it carelessly. "Silas," she said, "I know it's not—" He stopped, tried again. "I know a woman like you might expect something different, more ceremony, better words." "I don't want different words," she said. "I want true ones." He looked at her in the cold November light. "I want to build a life with you," he said, "on this mountain, with May. I want to find out what we are when we stop being people who are still figuring it out and start being people who have decided." A pause. "I've decided. I'd like to know if you have." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the ring from his palm, not putting it on, just holding it. She looked at it in her hand. "Clara wore this," she said. "She did. You loved her. Very much. And this is—" She looked up. "This isn't a replacement for that." "No," he said. "It's not a replacement for anything. It's a different thing. Both things are real." She closed her hand around the ring. She looked at the mountain. He waited because he had learned how to wait, and because she deserved the time. "Yes," she said. "I've decided." She put the ring on. It was slightly large for her finger, which was a practical problem they would solve practically. She held her hand out and looked at it for a moment, and whatever she was thinking, her expression was the clearest he had seen it in all the months he'd known her. Not happy in a performed way, just clear, the way the air is clear after a storm. He reached out and covered her hand with his. They stood like that for a moment, in the cold, in front of the woodpile, with the mountain above them and the sound of May moving around inside the cabin through the wall. "She's going to act like she knew," Vivian said. "She did know," Silas said. "I know she knew," Vivian said. "I'm just noting that she's going to act like it." They went inside. May looked up from her lessons. She looked at Vivian's hand. She looked at Silas. She looked back at her lessons. "Finally," she said, and turned the page. Edmund arrived in December, which Silas had expected and Vivian had expected and May had predicted with the accuracy of someone who had been tracking the situation closely. He arrived with more preparation than his September visit, sent word ahead this time, came with Garrett and one other man, brought a case of something from Denver that turned out to be preserves and smoked meat, and 2 bottles of something he and Silas drank cautiously over the following evenings by the fire. He brought May the book about birds of prey. He brought Vivian a letter from a woman in Denver she'd been close to, and a bundle of other correspondence that had been collecting since her departure. He sat at the table the first evening and looked at the ring on Vivian's finger for a long time without saying anything about it. Vivian let him look. She did not hide her hand or present it for inspection. She just let him be wherever he was with it. "Well," he said, finally. "Well," Vivian said. He looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him, steady, giving him the space to be whatever he needed to be. Edmund picked up his glass. He looked into it. He was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of a man who has prepared several versions of what he was going to say and has just decided none of them were right. "I owe you an accounting," he said to Silas. "You don't," Silas said. "I do." Edmund set the glass down. "The things I said in the camp, in January, after Haskell told me to stop searching. The things I said about—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "About men who chose to live the way you live. On the margins of things, away from what I understood as civilization." He looked at his hands on the table. "I said things that were not true, and I said them with a conviction that a man in my position knows how to make convincing. And I said them because I was a man who had decided that the quality of a life could be measured by its proximity to what I had built. And that judgment was—" He stopped again. "It was wrong. It was a wrong I can account for and cannot entirely repair, and I want you to know that I know the difference." The cabin was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing something patient against the eaves. "I know you know," Silas said. "I want to say it," Edmund said, "out loud, in this room, because you never asked me to, and that means you deserve to hear it." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I hear it." Edmund nodded once. the same stiff nod of a man conceding something that costs him. Then he picked up his glass again. He looked at Vivian, and there was something in the look that was not entirely resolved. There was still the father who had arranged a future and watched it rearrange itself, still the grief of that. But underneath it, or alongside it, was something that had been building since September. Something closer to seeing her than looking at her. "Your mother would have liked him," Edmund said. Vivian looked at her father. Whatever she'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. "I know," she said, after a moment, quietly. "She would have liked all of this," Edmund said, gesturing at the room, at the mountain beyond it, at whatever he meant by all of this. "She always thought I'd gotten us too far indoors." He paused. "She would have come up here in about 30 minutes, and she never would have left." May, at the other end of the table with her bird book, said without looking up, "She sounds like me." Edmund looked at her, and for the first time in all the months of Silas observing Edmund Ashcroft in various states of difficulty, the man laughed. Not a polite social laugh. A real one, startled out of him, the laugh of someone who got hit by something true in a blind spot. "She does," he said. "She really does." The winter that came after that was the hardest in terms of weather and the easiest in terms of everything else. They lost 2 weeks in January to a storm system that made the one that had almost killed Vivian look like a rehearsal. Silas had seen it coming 4 days out and had prepared with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the mountain did not make exceptions for new circumstances, and the preparation held. They were warm and supplied, and the animals were safe, and the roof that Edmund's men had repaired in the spring did not fail them the way it would have failed them before. Vivian spent those 2 weeks doing 3 things: reading, helping May with lessons that had become genuinely advanced now that May had access to a teacher with a proper education, and writing. She had started writing in October, in a journal that she did not show Silas and that he did not ask to see. What she was writing, she told him when he asked once, was the account of everything that had happened since January of the previous year, because she had decided it was worth writing down, not because she thought it would be read, but because the act of putting it into words was how she made sure she understood it. "The canyon," she said. "The cabin. My father's face on the trail when he saw me. All of it. I want to know what I actually think about it before too much time passes, and I start to remember it the way I want it to have been, rather than how it was." "What do you think about it?" he said. She considered. "I think that I was a person who had been very carefully constructed," she said. "Very deliberately formed into a specific shape. And then I got put into a situation that the shape wasn't designed for, and it cracked. And what came through the cracks turned out to be more interesting than the original shape." She paused. "I think that's not a comfortable thing to discover about yourself. That you were more interesting than you thought, and that it took a near-death experience to find that out." She paused again. "I think I want to know what else is in there, without requiring another near-death experience to find it." He looked at her. "You're different than you were." "I know. I mean, from January. You're different than the woman I carried down the mountain." "Is that a problem?" she said. "No," he said. "I'm noting it because I think you should know I see it. You're not the same, and I'm not trying to hold on to the version I found. I'm interested in the version that's here now." She looked at him in the firelight with an expression that was not soft exactly. Vivian did not tend toward softness in her expressions. But that had something in it that was direct and certain, and without any performance in it at all. "You're better at this than you think you are," she said. "At what?" "At saying the right thing." "I just say what's true," he said. "That's what I mean," she said. May, who was listening with the focused non-attention she had deployed since September on adult conversations she had decided were important, turned a page of her book with the careful, deliberate movement of someone making sure a page doesn't make noise. In the spring, 3 things happened that changed the character of the life they were building, not in kind, but in scale. The first was that word came up from Cedar Fork about the possibility of a school. The settlement below had grown enough over the past 2 years. Families moving in, the railroad extension bringing commerce, and with it permanence. That there were 12 children between the ages of 5 and 14 with no formal education available closer than a 2-day ride. The man who ran the dry goods store, a practical Swede named Lindqvist, had written to the county about it without result, and had then written to anyone in his immediate sphere who might have an opinion, and the letter had somehow found its way to Vivian, possibly because Lindqvist had heard she was educated and had the slight desperation of a man who will ask anything of anyone when he's been ignored by the official channels. Vivian read the letter twice, folded it, and left it on the table where Silas would see it. He read it that evening. He set it back down. He looked at it for a moment. "This is something you want to do," he said. It was not a question. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm thinking about whether I'm qualified. You've been teaching May for 4 months. May is exceptional. The other children will still learn things," he said. "That's usually the standard." She looked at him. "You'd be all right with it? The trips down, Vivian," he said, "I did not take you off a mountain so you could sit in a cabin and wait for things to do." He paused. "Do what you're built for." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face. "That," she said, "is what I mean about saying the right thing." She wrote to Lindqvist. The conversation that followed took most of the spring and involved several letters, 2 visits to Cedar Fork, a discussion with Edmund that was more productive than any of them had expected, and a practical negotiation about a building that a family named Corrigan had half constructed and abandoned when they'd moved on the previous fall. By June there was a school. It was 1 room, rough, with a wood stove that would need to be fed constantly in winter and windows that let in the drafts, even when closed. It held 14 students on its first day, because news had traveled the way news travels in small places, and 2 of the children came from further than Cedar Fork entirely. May was the oldest student and conducted herself with a modesty about this that lasted approximately 1 week before reverting to her natural state, which was that of a person who has opinions about how things should be done and is not shy about sharing them. Vivian handled this with the patience and firmness of someone who understood that managing May required respecting her intelligence while also not letting it run the room, which was a balance that Silas had been working on for 7 years and was glad to have assistance with. The second thing that happened in the spring was Edmund. The financial collapse that came for him had been building for longer than anyone outside his closest circle had known. The railroad extension that he had bet heavily on had run into a combination of bad ground surveys and a congressional dispute over land rights that tied up the eastern segment for 18 months. And the creditors who had been patient through 2 cycles of delay ran out of patience in March and came for what they were owed. Edmund had been wealthy enough that losing a significant portion of what he had built did not leave him destitute. He was not a ruined man in the absolute sense. But the empire, as he had built it, contracted severely and rapidly, and the Denver house went, and 3 other properties went, and the staff that had run his life for 30 years dispersed to other employers. And Edmund Ashcroft found himself, at 61 years old, significantly alone in a significantly smaller life than the one he had organized himself for. The letter he sent Silas, not Vivian Silas, arrived in early April. It was the shortest letter Edmund had ever written to either of them. It said, "I find myself in reduced circumstances. I wanted you to know before Vivian did because I imagine my pride is going to make this conversation difficult, and I would rather you had the full picture before I managed to obscure part of it. E.A." Silas read the letter sitting at the table before Vivian was up, in the early morning quiet. He read it once. He set it down. He drank his coffee. When Vivian came out, he handed it to her without saying anything. She read it. She set it down on the table. She was quiet for a moment. "He wrote to you first," she said. "He did. Because he knew I'd react and he wanted you to be prepared." She paused. "He trusts you." "More than he expected to," Silas said. She looked at the letter. Her expression was not pity. Vivian did not tend toward pity, for her father or anyone, but there was something in it that was careful and real. "He's going to come here," she said. "Eventually, when he runs out of other places to put himself." "I know," Silas said. "Is that—" She looked at him. "I know the cabin is large enough," he said. "It's not, physically." "We can make it larger," he said. "Garrett knows construction. We've been talking about the back addition anyway." She looked at him. "You've been talking about the back addition?" "Since February," he said. "Winter gave me time to think about the layout." He picked up his coffee. "I figured we'd need the room eventually." She stared at him. "You planned for this." "I planned for the general principle," he said, "that life brings people who need somewhere to be, and it's better to have the room before they need it than after. He paused. Your father is going to need somewhere to be. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the letter. Then she said very quietly, Silas? What? Nothing, she said. Just Silas. He drank his coffee. Edmund arrived in June, 6 weeks after the letter. He came with 2 trunks, which was less than he'd ever traveled with in his life, and more than he'd initially said he'd bring, which Vivian told Silas was exactly what she'd expected. He was thinner than September. He had the look of a man whose external scaffolding has been removed and who is discovering, with some discomfort and some relief, that the structure underneath it is more solid than he'd thought. He stood in front of the expanded cabin. Garrett and 2 other men had put the back addition up in May, rough but sound, and looked at it with an expression that Silas could not entirely read. You built this, Edmund said. Garrett did most of the work, Silas said. You planned it. I drew a shape on a piece of paper, Silas said. Garrett turned it into a building. Edmund looked at it. He looked at Silas. You planned it before you knew I was coming. I planned it because I thought we'd need the room eventually. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Why? He said. And it was not a suspicious question. It was the genuine question of a man who is trying to understand something that doesn't fit his existing model. Why would you do that after everything? He stopped. I wasn't kind to you. In the ways that matter, I was not a kind man to you. No, Silas agreed. You weren't. And yet, Silas said. Edmund looked at the addition again. I don't know what to do with that, he said. You don't have to do anything with it, Silas said. Just put your trunks in it. Edmund looked at him. The thing that had been building at the corner of his mouth since September, finally, fully, became what it had been working toward. It was a real smile, not a social smile, not the controlled expression of a man managing a room. A real one, the kind that comes from somewhere below the management. You're an infuriating man, Edmund said. Clara thought so too, Silas said. They brought the trunks in. The summer that followed was not uncomplicated. Edmund was not a man who adjusted to a smaller life without friction, and he did not suddenly become easy to live with simply because he had undergone difficulty. He had opinions about how things should be done that conflicted with how Silas did them, and he had the habit of making those opinions known, and Silas had the equal and opposite habit of listening to them with apparent patience and then continuing to do things the way he'd been doing them, which drove Edmund to distraction. He said so once, directly. You listen to everything I say and change nothing, Edmund said. I listen to everything you say, Silas agreed. Some of it is useful. And the rest? The rest is how you think things should be done, Silas said, which is different from how they need to be done up here. Edmund sat with that. You're saying I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm saying you know a great deal about a set of things that is different from the set of things that matters here, Silas said. That's not the same as not knowing what you're talking about. It's just different territory. Edmund looked at him. You said that before, about me needing to map the territory. I said it to Vivian, Silas said. She told you. She tells me things, Edmund said. More things than she used to. He paused. I used to think it meant I was losing ground when she argued with me. I've come to understand it means she trusts me enough to argue. He paused again. That took me longer than it should have. Most things take as long as they take, Silas said. Edmund looked at the mountains above the tree line, at the particular quality of a summer afternoon at elevation, the sky a blue that didn't exist at lower altitudes. He had started spending time outdoors in ways he never had before. Not working, not going anywhere, just sitting with the mountain the way you sit with something you are trying to understand. It had taken him a month to stop looking impatient while he did it and start looking like he was actually there. What do you need? Silas said. Actually need. Not what you're used to. What would make this? He looked for the word. Yours. Edmund thought about it, really thought about it, which was something he was getting better at, taking a question seriously instead of answering it with the first competent response available. Something to run, he said finally. Not large. I don't need large anymore. But something that requires organizing, management, something that moves. Silas thought about the school. He thought about Lindqvist and his letters that went unanswered by the county. He thought about the 14 children in that one-room building with one teacher who was excellent but stretched thin, and about the 3 families that had moved into the valley since the spring and had children of their own that would need the school by fall. The school needs a board, he said, someone to manage the county correspondence, the supply arrangements, the building maintenance. He paused. Vivian runs the teaching. Nobody's running the administration. Edmund looked at him. A school board, he said. I built a railroad. You built a railroad and you lost it, Silas said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Now you're here. And the school needs someone who knows how to write letters to county officials and make them respond. Edmund was quiet. May is reading 2 years above her age because your daughter taught her, Silas said. There are 14 other children down there who aren't going to have that if the school runs out of paper and the roof caves in and nobody handles the money. He paused. You know how to handle those things. Edmund looked at the mountain for a moment. Then he looked at Silas with the expression that Silas had come to understand meant he had decided something and was letting himself decide it before he said it out loud. I'll need proper correspondence paper, Edmund said. The county officials won't respond to anything that looks improvised. Garrett's making a supply run next week, Silas said. Edmund nodded once, the decision settled. He picked up the cup of coffee he'd been holding and drank from it, and he did not say anything else about it, because in the Boone cabin decisions that had been made did not require extended discussion. He wrote his first letter to the county on a Tuesday. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied with it. He sent it with Garrett and had a response within 2 weeks, which was faster than anything Lindqvist had managed in 18 months, because Edmund Ashcroft knew which language to speak to which kind of official and had the patience now to speak it quietly rather than with the force he'd once used as a matter of course. The response came with a modest allocation for school supplies and a promise to look into the building issue, which was more than the school had gotten before and less than it needed, but it was a beginning. May watched her grandfather write the 3rd draft of the letter at the table and said, "The second one was better." Edmund looked at her. "The second one was adequate," he said. "The 3rd one is correct." May considered this. "What's the difference?" "The adequate one said what I wanted to say," Edmund said. "The correct one says what they need to hear." May looked at this for a moment with the expression that meant she was filing it. "That's useful," she said. "Most things I know are useful," Edmund said. "I'm just now figuring out which situations they're useful for." He looked up from the letter and found Silas watching him from across the room. Silas looked back at him, steady, the same way he'd looked at him on the trail in January and in the stable and at the table the evening of his September visit. The same look, unhurried, without judgment in it, but without softness either, just seeing him, actually seeing him, the way very few people in Edmund's life had ever taken the trouble to do. Edmund held that look for a moment. Then he looked back at his letter. "Thank you," he said. "For the room." "It needed to be built anyway," Silas said. "That's not—" Edmund stopped. He knew by now that pushing Silas on this kind of thing was like pushing the mountain. "Thank you," he said again. "You're welcome," Silas said. The school held its first full term that fall with 17 students and 1 teacher and a functioning board that had secured a second allocation from the county and was in correspondence with a teacher training program in Denver about a possible second instructor for the spring. May was still the oldest student and still had opinions about the curriculum that she expressed to her stepmother with a directness that Vivian had mostly stopped trying to moderate because moderation was not making a dent, and also because, as she told Silas one evening, May was usually right. Vivian was not only a teacher, she had started writing the account she'd been keeping into something more formal, not a record for herself anymore, but a description of the mountain, the community, the way people lived at elevation, and what that required of them, and what it gave back. She was not sure what it was, exactly, or what she'd do with it. She wrote it because the writing made her understand things she hadn't understood before she put them into words, which was the only reason she had ever needed for anything. Silas read it once, the first 40 pages, when she left it on the table one evening. He read it carefully, the way he did everything. He set it back down. "It's good," he said. "You're biased," she said. "I'm not sentimental," he said. "It's good." She looked at him. "Anything wrong with it?" He thought. "The part about the canyon," he said, "Ed. You make it sound cleaner than it was." She looked at the pages. "I know," she said. I keep trying to make it make more sense than it did. On the page, it wants to be a story with a shape. In reality, it was just cold and dark and very slow. Write the cold and dark and slow, he said. That's the true part. She looked at him, then she picked up the pages and went back to work. The first snow of the second winter came on a Wednesday in late October, and it came the way the first snow always came up here. Suddenly, completely, transforming everything in the space of an hour from one thing into another. Silas stood at the window and watched it come down and felt the familiar thing. He felt every year at the first snow, which was not quite pleasure and not quite dread, but something in between that he had never found a word for. The knowledge that the mountain was becoming itself again, that the terms were going to change. He heard footsteps, and May was beside him, her chin just clearing the windowsill now, looking at the same snow. "It's starting," she said. "Yep," he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching it. "Papa," she said. "What? Are you happy?" He looked at her. She was looking at the snow with the expression she used for serious questions, the one that meant she wanted an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. He looked back at the snow. He thought about what the word meant, and whether it was the right word for the thing he felt when he looked around at what was in this cabin and what was in the cabin next to it, and what was happening in the one-room building down in Cedar Fork on the days Vivian was there. He thought about Clara, whose ring was on someone else's hand now, and whose absence was still real, was still the specific shape of a missing thing, but whose presence was also real in the daughter beside him and in the habits he'd carried up from that loss and the life those habits had made. Happy was not quite the word. Happy was too simple for something that had this many layers and this much history in it. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." May nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Behind them, Vivian was at the table writing. Edmund was at the other end of the table with his correspondence, his pen moving with the precise, deliberate strokes of a man who has decided that whatever he puts in writing, he means. The fire was medium and steady. Outside, the snow came down patient and indifferent and complete, covering the mountain in the white that it wore for 5 months of every year, that Silas had learned to read like a language, that Vivian now read beside him, that May had been reading since she was old enough to look out a window. The mountain did not care about any of them. It had held its cold and its silence for longer than anyone could measure, and it would keep holding it after all of them were gone. It did not forgive, and it did not punish. It simply was what it was, and what it asked of the people who chose to live on it was that they be willing to be what they were too, without performance, without the comfortable fiction of control, without the pride that made men ride past a canyon they hadn't checked because checking it was hard. One man had gone back, not because he was braver than the others, not because he was better, because he had a rule he'd never found a way around. And the rule was that he could not walk away from something that might still have a chance just because walking toward it was difficult. That rule had cost him once, in the years when the thing he couldn't walk away from was Clara's illness, and there was nothing the walking could do. He had walked toward it anyway, uselessly, the way he'd told Vivian about running toward a thing he couldn't change. Arriving out of breath to find the outcome had not waited for him. That had been its own kind of education, the hardest kind. The kind that teaches you not by giving you what you were reaching for, but by showing you clearly what you could not hold. But in January, in a canyon on the north face of a mountain that 50 men had decided was empty, the rule had worked the way rules sometimes do when the conditions are right and you have not yet broken yourself of them. He had gone up. The thing he thought might still have a chance had still had a chance. He had carried it down, stiffly, awkwardly, talking to it about May and traplines because talking was what his mind needed while his body was doing what it was doing. And here was what that had made. Here was the snow coming down outside and the fire inside, and his daughter growing up and his wife writing at the table and her father managing correspondence for a school in a mountain settlement. And the hawk May had been tracking for 3 seasons, who had turned up again this fall, with, May was convinced, 2 offspring from the spring. Here was the life that had come from not walking away. It was not a perfect life. It was full of the things that real lives are full of, difficulty and adjustment, and people who annoyed each other, and problems that didn't resolve cleanly, and grief that stayed where it was even when everything around it got better. Edmund still had his opinions. May still had more questions than Silas had answers for. The school roof still leaked in 2 places that Garrett hadn't gotten to. Silas still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning with the specific hollow feeling that Clara's absence left in the dark. But it was real. It was built on things that had been tested by cold and loss and pride and the particular cruelty of storms that don't care what you had planned. What was standing after all that testing was standing because it deserved to stand. Silas turned from the window. Vivian looked up from her writing. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for almost 2 years now, with the directness of someone who has decided that seeing clearly is worth more than seeing comfortably. He looked back at her. No words. They didn't need them. He went to the fire and fed it, and the cabin held the warmth, and outside the mountain went on being what it was, which was exactly